Section 1. The surface: what everyone knows and what nobody questioned. There is a show that has been running longer than most of the people watching this video have been alive. A show so woven into the fabric of American culture that its characters are more recognizable than most presidents, its catchphrases more quoted than most literature, and its fictional town more thoroughly mapped and documented than some real cities on the planet. The Simpsons has been on the air since December 17th, 1989. That is not a typo. 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes, decades of Sunday nights. Generations of viewers who grew up, had children of their own, and then sat down with those children to watch the same yellow family live in the same yellow house on the same street in a town that has never once appeared on a real map of America. And yet, for all of that time, for all of that cultural saturation, most people have only ever seen the surface of this show. They know Homer's donut, they know Bart's chalkboard, they know the couch gag and the opening credits sequence, and the way the family rushes in from different directions to collapse onto the sofa in front of the television. They know the jokes, they know the catchphrases, they know the general shape of a Simpsons episode, the way it begins as one thing and slowly becomes something else entirely by the final act. But underneath all of that, underneath 36 years of jokes and callbacks and guest appearances and couch gags, there is something else, something stranger. Something that has been accumulating in the margins of this show since the very first episode aired and has never once been fully addressed or explained. There are levels to this show that most viewers have never reached, and that is what tonight is about. This is the Simpsons Iceberg, version 2.1. The iceberg format, for anyone unfamiliar, is a way of organizing information from the most accessible and widely known at the very top, down through increasingly obscure, increasingly strange, and increasingly unsettling material the deeper you go. The surface of the iceberg is the stuff everyone knows, the stuff you can find on a Wikipedia summary or a fan wiki with a casual search. But as you descend, the information gets stranger, the connections get more elaborate, the questions start to outweigh the answers, and by the time you reach the very bottom of the iceberg, you are in territory that the show itself has never acknowledged, territory that exists in the overlap between what the writers put on screen and what the audience has been quietly piecing together for 3.5 decades. Tonight, we are going all the way down. We are starting at the surface and descending, slowly and deliberately, through every level of this iceberg. And if you are listening to this late at night, if you are settling in for a few hours of comfortable background narration while Springfield quietly unravels around you, then you are in exactly the right place. Let the lights go down, get comfortable, and let's start at the beginning. The pilot that almost wasn't. Before there was a Simpsons, there was a sketch. Matt Groening, a cartoonist who had been publishing a comic strip called Life in Hell since the late 1970s, was summoned to a meeting at the production company of James L. Brooks in 1987. The meeting was about creating animated shorts for a new variety show called The Tracy Ullman Show. Groening arrived with the intention of pitching Life in Hell as the basis for the animated segments. He had characters ready. He had a concept prepared. And then, while sitting in the waiting room before the meeting, he changed his mind. The reason he changed his mind was practical. Life in Hell was his livelihood. The comic strip was already successful enough to support him, and signing over the animation rights to a television production company felt like an unnecessary risk. If the show failed, he might have damaged something that was already working. So, in the time it took to wait for the meeting to begin, Groening invented an entirely new family. He named them after members of his own family. Homer and Marge were his parents' names. Lisa and Maggie were his sisters. Bart was an anagram of the word brat, which Groening has confirmed in interviews was entirely intentional. The shorts that resulted from that meeting were rough. The animation was crude, the characters slightly off-model from what they would eventually become, and the stories were simple domestic vignettes, rather than the elaborate satirical constructions that would define the full series. But they were funny. They were sharp in a way that animated content at that time rarely was, and they built enough of an audience that Fox, then a fledgling network still trying to establish itself as a legitimate player in the television landscape, commissioned a full half-hour Christmas special to air in December of 1989. That special was called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire. It was the story of Homer discovering that he would not be receiving his Christmas bonus, secretly taking a job as a department store Santa Claus to make up the difference, losing the money he earned at a dog track, and then adopting the losing greyhound, who would become the family's pet, Santa's Little Helper. It was a warm story. It was gentle. It was the kind of story that introduced you to a family in the most generous possible light, showing you their financial stress and their dysfunction and their occasional cruelty to each other, but grounding all of it in something that felt unmistakably like love. Fox moved the special to be the series premiere. The Simpsons, as a full ongoing series, launched on the back of a Christmas episode. This is a piece of trivia that tends to surprise people who have seen the show for years without knowing it. The episode most people think of as the pilot, which is Bart the Genius, the story of Bart cheating on an intelligence test and being placed in a school for gifted children, was actually the second episode to air. The show began with a Christmas story. It began with Homer failing at his job and trying to give his family something good despite having almost nothing. That is the emotional foundation everything else was built on top of. The yellow skin decision. One of the most immediately recognizable visual choices in the history of animation is the yellow skin of the Simpson family and most of the residents of Springfield. It is so iconic at this point that it has become shorthand for the show itself. Simpsons yellow is a specific shade. It is bright and slightly sickly and unmistakable from 20 feet away. And the reason the characters are yellow has been explained by Matt Groening in interviews, but the explanation is simpler and more practical than most people expect. Groening's reasoning was that he wanted the characters to be immediately identifiable as The Simpsons when viewers were channel surfing. In the early days of the show, when someone was flipping through channels on their television, Groening wanted there to be a single frame, a single glimpse of the screen, that would make the viewer stop and recognize the show without needing to see anything else. Yellow skin, he reasoned, was something you would never see on any other program. It was a visual signal that could not be confused with anything else on television. The choice worked. Simpsons yellow became one of the most recognizable color choices in the history of the medium. But it also, unintentionally, created one of the most elaborate and compelling fan theories the show has ever generated. Because yellow skin, in the real world, is not a neutral physical characteristic. It is a symptom. And the people who have spent serious time thinking about what Springfield actually is and what it has done to its residents have noticed that detail and followed it somewhere the show has never officially gone. We will get there, but for now the surface-level truth is simply that yellow was a practical decision made by a cartoonist in a waiting room who needed to distinguish his characters from everything else on the dial. And it worked so well that 36 years later, every child on the planet knows exactly what it means when they see that color. The four-fingered hand. Another immediately visible characteristic of every character in Springfield is that they have 4 fingers on each hand instead of 5. This is not unique to The Simpsons. It is a convention that dates back to the earliest days of animation, used by studios including Disney and Warner Brothers throughout the golden age of cartoons. The practical reason is simple. 4 fingers are easier and faster to draw than 5. When animators are producing thousands of frames of content, removing 1 finger from each hand across every character saves a meaningful amount of time and labor. But there is a recurring joke embedded in the show that comments on this directly. The Simpsons has, across its run, made several jokes about the 4-fingered nature of its characters, usually in the context of meta-humor that acknowledges the show is aware of its own artificiality. In one episode, a character makes a comment about the world being different in some unspecified way that is clearly referencing the finger count without stating it outright. In another, a character uses the phrase, "talk to the 4" in a variation of a real-world expression. What is more interesting, though, is what the missing finger represents to the people who have built theories around it. Within the logic of the Springfield contamination theory, the 4 fingers are not an animation convention at all. They are a mutation. They are the physical evidence of what happens when multiple generations of a population are exposed to chronic low-level radiation in their food supply, their water, and their air. Real-world radiation exposure does not typically cause people to lose fingers, but it does cause genetic changes that accumulate across generations. And the characters of Springfield have been accumulating those changes across 36 years of story without anyone ever asking what is causing them. The 4-fingered hand is the most visible piece of the mutation puzzle. And it is, in the universe of the show, completely normal. Nobody in Springfield has ever looked at their hands and noticed that something was missing. Bart's full name, Bartholomew Jojo Simpson. This is Bart's full legal name, confirmed in multiple episodes across the series. Bartholomew is the name, Jojo is the middle name. And while the Bartholomew part feels almost comically formal for a character who defines himself through his rejection of formality and rules, the JoJo has always struck fans as the stranger choice. Why JoJo? Where did it come from? The official answer, to the extent that one exists, is that the writers found it funny. JoJo, as a middle name for a 10-year-old boy who thinks of himself as a rebel, has a comedic incongruity to it that fits the show's general sensibility. But fans have gone further. There is a recurring character in the show named Dr. Nick, whose full name is Dr. Nick Riviera, and who is Springfield's least qualified and most frequently called upon medical professional. Some theorists have drawn connections between the names of background characters and the Simpsons family, suggesting that Springfield's recurring cast is more interconnected than the show has ever explicitly stated. Bart's name is also notable for what it is not. Despite the show establishing that Bart is an anagram of brat, the character himself has never acknowledged this. In 36 seasons, across hundreds of episodes that have made every possible joke about language and wordplay and cultural references, no one in Springfield has ever pointed out to Bart that his name is a scrambled version of an insult. This is either because the writers considered it too obvious to bother with, or because there is a version of Springfield's reality in which Bart's parents named him something that could be rearranged into an insult without noticing. Given what we know about Homer, the second option is entirely plausible. The chalkboard gag's hidden messages. The opening credits of The Simpsons have been analyzed more thoroughly than the opening credits of perhaps any other television show in history. The couch gag at the end of the sequence gets most of the attention, because it changes with every episode and has been used as a space for elaborate visual jokes, parodies, and guest animator showcases for decades. But the chalkboard gag, in which Bart writes a sentence repeatedly on a classroom blackboard as punishment for some infraction the episode never explains, has its own history worth examining. The chalkboard sentences are written specifically for each episode by the show's writing staff. They are almost always commentary on something topical, something the writers found funny, or something that reflected the general spirit of what was happening in the broader world at the time of production. Some of the early ones are relatively gentle. I will not waste chalk. I will not skateboard in the halls. I did not see Elvis. These establish Bart's character in shorthand. He is someone who has done things that required this kind of repetitive punishment, and he is not particularly sorry about any of them. But as the show progressed and the writers became more comfortable with the format, the chalkboard messages became stranger and more pointed. Some of them are inside jokes about the production. Some are direct responses to controversies the show was involved in. Some are almost surreal in their specificity. I am not a 32-year-old woman. I will not call the principal Spudhead. Organ transplants are best left to the professionals. There is one chalkboard gag that fans have returned to repeatedly because of how it resonates with certain theories about the show. In an early episode, the sentence is, "I will not expose the ignorance of the faculty." This is funny on the surface because it sounds like exactly the kind of thing a school would punish a student for writing. But within the context of a show where the Springfield educational system has been consistently depicted as underfunded, poorly administered, and staffed by teachers who range from burned out to actively incompetent, the line reads differently. It reads like a genuine warning. It reads like the show telling you, very early in its run, that there are things in Springfield that the people in charge would prefer you did not examine too closely. The couch gag as a documentary record. The couch gag is the variable element in The Simpsons opening credits, and it has served so many different functions over the show's run that cataloging them all would require more time than this section allows. But there are a few specific couch gags that deserve attention at the surface level, because they represent something more than just a funny visual joke. They represent the show's relationship with its own mythology. In one of the most famous couch gags, the family rushes in to find that an entirely different animated family has already taken the couch. The two families stare at each other. Then both of them leave. It is a 2-second joke about the generic nature of the animated family sitcom, but it is also a moment of self-awareness about what The Simpsons is. It is one family among many, and the couch it occupies is not guaranteed to be its own. In another, the family rushes in and finds the couch in an empty white void. They sit. Nothing else happens. The emptiness of the setting, the absence of everything except the family and the furniture, reads under certain theories as an image of pure dream logic. A man in a coma, imagining his family on a couch that exists nowhere and everywhere at once. The most elaborate couch gags have been produced by guest animators, including Don Hertzfeldt, whose contribution depicted a distant future in which degraded, corrupted versions of the Simpsons characters continued to exist in a fractured and broken Springfield long after any coherent narrative had dissolved. It was genuinely unsettling. It was the kind of joke that required no punchline because the image itself carried all the weight. And it was, for a few seconds, the most honest thing the show had ever put on screen about what it might eventually become. Maggie's gun, the very first scene, the very first image in the very first episode of The Simpsons, is not Homer at work. It is not Bart in school. It is not the couch. The very first image, in the opening credits that debuted with the show in December of 1989, is Maggie Simpson at a grocery store checkout. She is sitting in the cart while Marge unloads items onto the conveyor belt. The cashier scans Marge's groceries. And then, without pausing, the cashier scans Maggie along with the rest of the items. A price appears on the register for Maggie: $847.63. The exact number has varied across different versions of the opening credits over the years, but the joke is always the same. The cashier scans the baby along with the food. Maggie is, in the cold logic of a grocery store scanner, a product. She has a price tag. She is, at least in the opening credits, something that can be measured and assessed and given a dollar value. This is the very first thing the show shows you. Before any episode has aired, before you know anything about any of these characters, the youngest member of the family is run through a checkout scanner and given a monetary value. The people who have spent time with the Maggie theories have returned to this image many times. Because Maggie, as we will discuss much later in this descent through the iceberg, is the character whose true nature the show has most consistently obscured. She is presented as passive, as helpless, as the background member of the family who occasionally does something remarkable and then retreats back into silence. And yet the show introduces her, in its very first moment, by assigning her a price, by running her through a system that quantifies everything, by making the question of what she is worth, in the most literal possible sense, the opening frame of 3.5 decades of television. Whether that was intentional or accidental is something the writers have never fully addressed. Springfield's real-world counterparts. The question of where Springfield is located has been discussed exhaustively by fans, journalists, and the show's creators. Matt Groening confirmed in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine that he named the town after Springfield, Oregon, where he grew up. He chose the name specifically because Springfield is one of the most commonplace names in the United States. There are Springfields in nearly every state in the Union. By naming the town Springfield, Groening made it simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, a town that could be any of its many real-world namesakes depending on where you were watching from. The show has taken deliberate steps to ensure that no single real Springfield can claim the fictional one as its own. Geographic details are contradicted from episode to episode. The town's relationship to other cities and states shifts depending on what the story requires. In some episodes, Springfield appears to be in the Northeast. In others, it is clearly in the Midwest. In the movie, it appears to be surrounded by terrain that does not correspond to any single region of the country. There is a Springfield, Oregon that has leaned into its connection to the show more enthusiastically than most of the others. The city has embraced Simpsons-related tourism, and in 2012, it was the site of the premiere of the Simpsons film. But even Groening's acknowledgement of Oregon as the inspiration did not settle the question definitively, because the show continued placing Springfield in contradictory geographic contexts after that interview was published. The revelation was almost immediately undermined by the show's own continued ambiguity. What is more interesting than the question of which real Springfield inspired the fictional one is the question of why the show has worked so hard to prevent the answer from mattering. Why does it matter to the show that Springfield's location remains undetermined? What is gained by the permanent ambiguity? We will return to this question at much greater depth in later sections, when we examine Springfield not as a setting but as a system, not as a place but as a mechanism, the recurring background characters and their hidden lives. Springfield is populated by a cast of recurring background and secondary characters whose lives, as glimpsed in fragments across hundreds of episodes, are considerably stranger and more elaborate than any casual viewer would notice. Some of them have received enough focused attention over the years that they have developed genuine fan followings and elaborate fan theories about their histories and their natures. But most of them exist in the margins, appearing and disappearing across decades of episodes without any single narrative thread connecting their appearances. There is Dr. Nick Riviera, Springfield's least qualified physician, who greets every patient with a cheerful, "Hi, everybody," and who has been shown to be catastrophically incompetent in every medical situation the show has placed him in. His degree is from questionable institutions. His procedures are improvised. His bedside manner is enthusiastic in a way that masks complete ignorance. And yet he continues to practice medicine in Springfield, seeing patients, performing operations, and presumably not being sued, because in Springfield, the medical establishment is apparently as compromised as everything else. There is Sideshow Bob, born Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr., who began as the silent sidekick on Krusty the Clown's children's television program and evolved across dozens of episodes into one of the show's most elaborate recurring antagonists. Bob is a classically trained, highly educated, genuinely brilliant man who has dedicated a disproportionate amount of his considerable intellect to the murder of a 10-year-old boy named Bart Simpson. The relationship between Bob and Bart is one of the show's most formally strange recurring dynamics, because it has never been resolved in any meaningful way. Bob keeps trying, Bart keeps surviving, and the show keeps finding new contexts for this loop to play out. There is Comic Book Guy, whose actual name, revealed only after many seasons of the show, is Jeff Albertson. He is the proprietor of Springfield's only comic book shop, which he runs with maximum condescension and minimum customer service. He is also, the show suggests, deeply lonely. His encyclopedic knowledge of popular culture and his aggressive intellectual superiority function as a defense mechanism for a man who has structured his entire identity around being the most knowledgeable person in any room, because that is the one context in which he cannot be rejected or dismissed. Comic Book Guy knows more than you, and in Springfield, knowing more than everyone else means being alone. These characters and dozens more like them form a kind of secondary city inside Springfield. They have their own lives, their own histories, their own stories that the show has told in pieces without ever assembling into a complete picture. Part of what makes this iceberg so deep is that it is not just about the Simpson family. It is about everyone who lives around them, everyone who exists in the contaminated geography of this impossible town, and what the show has quietly built in the spaces between the main stories. The show's golden age and what ended it. Fans of The Simpsons have debated the question of when the show's quality declined for as long as the show has been declining. The golden age is generally agreed to span from roughly season 3 through season 8, though some fans place the beginning earlier and the end later. These are the seasons that produce the episodes most consistently cited in greatest ever lists, the episodes that get referenced in comedy writing discussions, the episodes that shaped what smart satirical television could be in a way that is still felt in the medium today. What ended the golden age is a more contested question. The departure of showrunner Mike Scully at the end of season 8 is one commonly cited factor. Changes in the writing staff. The departure of Phil Hartman, who voiced recurring characters including Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz, and whose death in 1998 left gaps in the show's cast that were never fully filled. The general drift of the show toward more surreal and less grounded storylines. The increasing reliance on celebrity guest appearances as a substitute for character-driven storytelling. But there is a theory, one that we will examine more closely in a later section, that the golden age did not end because of production changes or staff turnover. It ended because something that happened within the story of the show itself changed the nature of what the show was. That theory locates the turning point in a specific episode in a specific season and argues that everything that followed was not a decline in writing quality, but a change in the fundamental nature of the reality the show was depicting. For now, at the surface level, it is enough to note that the golden age happened, that it produced some of the finest half hours of comedy television ever made, and that its ending is still mourned by the people who were there for it. The Simpsons that exists today is a different show from the one that aired in 1993. Whether that difference represents a natural evolution, a creative decline, or something stranger and more structural is one of the questions this iceberg is built to explore. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. It genuinely makes the late nights feel less quiet knowing people all over the world are tuning in from completely different corners of the earth. And if you want more of this, subscribing takes 2 seconds and means you will never miss one of these. Number Section 2. The Forgotten Characters. Springfield's hidden population. There is a version of Springfield that exists entirely in the background, not the Springfield of Homer and Marge and their children, not the Springfield of Burns and Smithers and the nuclear plant. A third Springfield, populated by people who have been appearing in the margins of episodes for 36 years without anyone ever stopping to ask who they are, where they came from, or why they keep showing up in the same town doing the same things across decade after decade of television. These are the forgotten characters, the background figures, the one-line extras who somehow became fixtures, the people whose stories the show has told in fragments so small and so scattered that assembling them into a coherent picture requires watching hundreds of hours of television with the specific intention of paying attention to everything that is not in the foreground. Most people have never done this. Most people watch The Simpsons for Homer and Bart and the plot. But the people who have done it, the ones who have spent genuine time cataloging what exists at the edges of the show's frame, have found something remarkable. Springfield's background is a fully realized world. It just was never meant to be examined this carefully. Hans Moleman and the question of biological impossibility. Hans Moleman is a small, elderly, nearly blind man who appears in the background of Springfield scenes with a frequency that, when you start paying attention to it, becomes genuinely strange. He is not a major character. He has no ongoing storyline. He does not have meaningful relationships with any of the main cast. He exists as a fixture of Springfield's background population, appearing in crowds, in waiting rooms, at public events, and occasionally as the subject of a short comedic vignette that usually ends with him being harmed in some way. The harm is the thing. Hans Moleman is the most frequently killed character in the history of American animation. He has been hit by cars, fallen from great heights, been buried alive, been attacked by animals, been struck by lightning, been incinerated, been crushed by falling objects, and suffered numerous other fatal outcomes across canonical, non-Halloween, non-dream episodes of the show. Not special episodes, regular episodes. Hans Moleman dies in regular episodes and then appears, without explanation, in subsequent episodes as if nothing happened. The most famous example of this pattern involves a short film within an episode, in which Moleman appears as the star of a film called Man Getting Hit by Football. This is, within the show's universe, a film that has been screened at a festival. It is a film about a man being struck in a specific region of the body by a football, and the man is Hans Moleman. And the film is presented as a genuine piece of cinema that audiences respond to with considerable enthusiasm. It is a film that has been seen by people in Springfield. Hans Moleman's suffering has been screened as entertainment, and Springfield watched it. Now, the surface-level reading of all of this is straightforward. Moleman dying repeatedly is a running joke. It is a piece of absurdist background humor that the show deploys when it needs a quick laugh from an audience that has come to recognize the pattern. It is not meant to be taken seriously. But Moleman himself said something in an early episode that the show dropped and never returned to. He stated, when asked, that he was 31 years old. 31. Hans Moleman, who appears to be in his late 80s or 90s, who moves with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body has been operating far past its intended specifications, who has the physical presentation of a man who has been old for decades, told the audience he was 31 years old. If he was telling the truth, and there is no reason within the episode to believe he was lying, then something happened to Hans Moleman that aged him catastrophically. Something took a man in his early 30s and compressed decades of biological aging into his body before its time. And that same something, whatever it is, has also made him very difficult to kill permanently, which is not a characteristic you would associate with extreme premature aging. Moleman looks like he should be fragile. He survives things that should be immediately fatal. These two facts together, the premature aging and the impossible resilience, describe a biological system that has been fundamentally altered. The radiation theory has a specific application to Moleman. If the nuclear plant's contamination affects different residents differently depending on their individual biology, their proximity to the plant, and the specific nature of their exposure, then Moleman might represent the most extreme mutation in Springfield. Not a mutation that enhanced him, the way certain theories suggest Maggie has been enhanced, but a mutation that distorted his biology so completely that the normal processes of cellular aging and cellular death simply do not apply to him in any recognizable way. He ages in appearance without aging in cellular function. He dies without dying completely. He resets, returns, and continues. He is, under this reading, the town's most extreme example of what the contamination can do to a human body when it is left to accumulate without any of the medical interventions that keep burns alive. Molman is what happens when a person in Springfield has no resources, no pharmaceutical infrastructure, and no Smithers managing their treatment schedule. He is the unmanaged version of what Burns has been carefully maintaining in himself for over a century. Burns has channeled the radiation's effects through treatment and technology into something that resembles extended, functional life. Molman has had no such management. The contamination has done to him, unfiltered and uncontrolled, whatever it wants. And what it wants, apparently, is something that defies every category the show usually applies to its characters. He is the only person in Springfield who has definitively died in canon and come back without any explanation. Every other character's resilience can be explained as cartoon logic. Molman's cannot, because the show has made his deaths specific and deliberate rather than incidental. They are not gags about a character being injured. They are gags about a character ceasing to live and then living again. That is a fundamentally different kind of joke, and it requires a fundamentally different kind of explanation. Groundskeeper Willie, the lonely architecture of a man without a country. Groundskeeper Willie is one of the show's most beloved secondary characters, which is somewhat remarkable given that his role, on paper, is as simple as it gets. He maintains the grounds of Springfield Elementary School. He has a Scottish accent so thick that it occasionally requires subtitles. He appears primarily when the script needs physical comedy, brute strength, or a character who will react to things with immediate, unfiltered emotion. He is angry in the way that only someone who has been disappointed enough times can be angry, with a depth and a consistency that suggests the anger is not a reaction to specific events, but a fundamental state of being. What the show has revealed about Willie across its run is considerably more interesting than his job description suggests. He is, for one thing, genuinely educated. In several episodes, Willie has demonstrated knowledge and intellectual capability that contradicts the simple character the show often uses him as. He speaks multiple languages. He has skills and knowledge from multiple disciplines. He has, in at least one episode, been revealed to have a history that is considerably more complex and considerably darker than his current position at an elementary school would imply. Willie is a man who has come down in the world. Whatever his history in Scotland was, and the show has given contradictory accounts of it across different episodes, he arrived in Springfield and ended up maintaining the grounds of a school for children who do not respect him and administrators who take him for granted. His accent makes him an outsider in a town that is not particularly welcoming to outsiders. His physical capability, which borders on the superhuman in episodes that need him to be strong, is deployed in service of tasks that do not require it to anywhere near its full extent. The Willie theories that exist in the deeper parts of the Simpsons fandom are less about what he is and more about who he used to be. There is a version of Willie's backstory, assembled from fragments scattered across many episodes, that suggests he was a man of some consequence in his home country before something went very wrong. The exact nature of what went wrong varies depending on which episodes you are pulling from, because the show has been inconsistent about Willie's past in the same way it has been inconsistent about many characters' histories. But the emotional reality of Willie as a character, the way he carries himself, the way he reacts to being dismissed or overlooked, the way he seems to exist in a state of permanent disappointment that goes beyond anything his current circumstances could account for, suggests a man who knows the distance between where he is and where he was. Willie's relationship with animals is also worth examining. He has a communication with animals, dogs in particular, that goes beyond normal human-animal relationships. He has been depicted talking to them in ways that suggest genuine mutual understanding. He has, in at least one episode, been shown sleeping with or living near animals in a way that blurs the line between him and the natural world. Some fan theories suggest that Willie's connection to the natural world, his comfort with physical labor and outdoor conditions that would be challenging for most people, represents a kind of baseline humanity that the show contrasts with the more corrupted humanity of Springfield's other residents. Willie is, in this reading, one of the few people in Springfield who has not been entirely remade by the town's contaminated environment, possibly because he arrived as an adult from somewhere else, and his basic biology was established before Springfield had the opportunity to reshape it. This is speculative, but it fits a pattern that the show has been quietly building for decades. The people who came to Springfield from outside it are consistently drawn differently from the people who grew up there. They look different, they move differently, they think more clearly. Willie fits this pattern. He may be miserable, he may be angry, he may be living a life dramatically smaller than the one he deserves. But he is not broken in the specific way that Springfield's long-term residents are broken. He has retained something that the town has taken from the people who were there from the beginning. Lenny Leonard and Carl Carlson. The friendship that deserved more. Homer's two best friends at the nuclear plant, Lenny Leonard and Carl Carlson, are among the show's most consistently present secondary characters. They appear in nearly every Homer at Work sequence. They are at Moe's Tavern with Homer more often than not, and they have been his companions and confidants across 36 seasons of episodes, without either of them receiving anywhere near the focused attention their longevity in the cast would seem to warrant. What the show has done with Lenny and Carl across its run is quietly fascinating when you pay attention to it. Both characters have hidden depths that are revealed in fragments, usually as one-off jokes that the show immediately moves past. Lenny, for instance, has been revealed to have a master's degree. In what discipline? The show has never specified, and the revelation has been treated as a punchline rather than a piece of character development. But the image it creates of a man with an advanced academic credential spending his working life in the poorly maintained guts of a nuclear reactor operating under an incompetent safety inspector is genuinely interesting. Why is Lenny here? What choices led a man with a master's degree to this particular sector of this particular plant? Carl has been given a more elaborate backstory than Lenny in certain episodes, including a reveal that he comes from Iceland, where he has a family history that the show treats as a punchline, but that, examined more carefully, suggests a man who is quite deliberately maintaining a simplified version of himself for the benefit of his Springfield relationships. There are episodes in which Carl's intelligence and capabilities are made visible for a moment before being retreated into the background again. He is, in these moments, someone who chose to be at the plant. Not someone who ended up there because there was nowhere else to go, but someone who made a decision to exist in a specific context for reasons the show has never fully explained. The friendship between Lenny and Carl is one of the show's most quietly tender ongoing elements. They are almost always together. They speak with a shorthand that implies decades of shared experience. They finish each other's thoughts. They defend each other reflexively. They are, in the simplest possible terms, deeply committed to each other in a way that the show has occasionally acknowledged directly, but has more often treated as background atmosphere. The exact nature of their relationship has been the subject of considerable fan discussion, and the show has been coy about it in ways that have evolved as cultural attitudes have changed over the show's run. What is clear, regardless of how you interpret the nature of their bond, is that Lenny and Carl represent something that the show values even when it does not examine it directly. They represent genuine loyalty in a town that does not have much of it. They have stayed friends across decades. They have stayed at the same jobs, in the same town, beside each other. Whatever Springfield has done to them, it has not dissolved what exists between them. And in a show that is largely about the ways that systems corrupt and diminish and isolate people, the persistence of that friendship is one of the few things that reads as genuinely hopeful. Patty and Selma Bouvier. The sisters the show underestimated. Marge Simpson's two sisters, Patty and Selma Bouvier, are presented in the show's early seasons primarily as antagonists to Homer. They dislike him. They have always disliked him. They have made their dislike of him consistent and vocal across hundreds of episodes, and Homer reciprocates with equal enthusiasm. The Patty and Selma hate Homer dynamic is one of the show's longest-running ongoing tensions, and it has generated a reliable source of comedic friction for 3.5 decades. But the sisters, when examined outside of their function as Homer's adversaries, are considerably more complex characters than their surface presentation suggests. They are both Department of Motor Vehicles employees, which is a detail that the show uses primarily for jokes about the soul-crushing mundanity of government bureaucracy, but which also means they are both people who have committed their professional lives to a specific kind of public service. They process licenses. They certify drivers. They are the gatekeepers of a specific and essential social function, and they have been performing that function, apparently without complaint, for as long as the show has been airing. Selma's personal life has been given more screen time than Patty's. She has been married multiple times. She desperately wants a child and eventually adopts one from China, a storyline that the show treated with more emotional weight than it typically affords to secondary characters. She has had relationships with men who were unavailable, unsuitable, or outright deceptive, and the show has occasionally paused its comedy to acknowledge that these experiences have left marks on her. Selma Bouvier is a woman who wants love and keeps encountering versions of love that are not quite the thing she was looking for. Patty's storyline, by contrast, has been given a single major revelation and then been left largely alone. The show revealed, in season 16, that Patty is gay. This was delivered as a plot point in an episode, addressed for the duration of that story, and then incorporated into Patty's character in a general way that has informed subsequent appearances without ever being the subject of another focused episode. The reveal was handled with what felt like genuine care for the character, which makes it notable by the standards of how the show has treated its secondary cast. But it also means that an element of Patty's identity that should have enormous implications for how she has experienced 36 years of life in Springfield was essentially addressed once and then filed away. The Bouvier sisters represent something the show has rarely interrogated directly: the experience of women in Springfield who exist outside the framework of the main family. They are not wives or mothers in the traditional Simpsons sense. They are sisters. They are colleagues. They are, in some respects, the show's most visible example of women whose primary relationships are with each other, rather than with men or children. And the show has occasionally seemed unsure of what to do with them when it is not using them to generate friction with Homer. Apu Nahasapi Mapetalon and the character the show could not hold. Apu Nahasapi Mapetalon is the owner and operator of the Quick E-Mart, Springfield's only convenience store, and he is arguably the most controversial character in the show's history. Not because of anything he did within the narrative of the show, but because of what he represented to a portion of the audience who had been watching him for decades and only gradually began articulating what bothered them about the way he was depicted. The specific controversy around Apu is complex and worth taking seriously, even in a context that is primarily focused on the show's mythology and mysteries rather than its cultural politics. Apu was voiced by Hank Azaria, a white actor, doing an exaggerated Indian accent. He was depicted through a cluster of stereotypes about South Asian immigrants that were recognizable and familiar to American audiences, but that many South Asian viewers found reductive and, over time, increasingly uncomfortable. The 2017 documentary The Problem with Apu, directed by and starring comedian Hari Kondabolu, articulated the specific nature of that discomfort in detail that sparked a broader cultural conversation about representation in animation. The show's response to the controversy was complicated. In an episode that aired in 2018, Lisa broke the fourth wall and addressed the Apu situation directly, suggesting that there were no easy answers, and that the question of how the show should respond was one it was uncertain about. This was read by many people as a dodge. By the following season, Apu's appearances in the show had been substantially reduced. He was not removed outright, but his presence became less central, and Hank Azaria eventually publicly announced that he would no longer voice the character. What is interesting from an iceberg perspective, setting aside the cultural politics entirely, is what happened to Apu within the show's mythology when he stepped back from his former prominence. Because Apu, as a character, had been given one of the most genuinely surprising and emotionally rich backstories of any secondary character on the show. He holds a doctorate in computer science from a highly prestigious university. He came to Springfield intending to pay off a student debt and ended up staying, building a life, marrying, having children, becoming in every meaningful sense a member of the community. He is one of the most formally educated people in Springfield, and he spends his days selling hot dogs and lottery tickets to Homer Simpson. The gap between what Apu is and what Apu does, between his capabilities and his circumstances, is one of the show's quieter, ongoing stories about what Springfield does to people. It traps them. It gives them enough comfort to stay, and not quite enough opportunity to reach what they might have been somewhere else. Apu stayed. He built something real. And then the show, for reasons that had nothing to do with his character and everything to do with the real world's reckoning with how he had been depicted, quietly moved him to the margins. He is still in Springfield. He still runs the Quick E-Mart, but he is a smaller presence now than he was, and the mythology he accumulated across dozens of years of focused attention has been left partially unresolved. Krusty the Clown, the most tragic man in Springfield. Herschel Schmoikel Pinchas Yeruchim Krustovsky, who performs under the name Krusty the Clown, is the host of a children's television program that has been running in Springfield for decades. He is beloved by children throughout the town. He is, within the show's universe, a genuine icon of popular entertainment, a man whose face appears on merchandise and whose program is appointment viewing for the youngest residents of Springfield. He is also one of the most miserable people the show has ever depicted. Krusty drinks heavily. He gambles compulsively. He has been bankrupt multiple times. He has been in jail. He has made choices, personal and professional, that have damaged himself and the people around him with a consistency that suggests not just bad luck, but a fundamental self-destructive drive. His personal relationships are a series of failures. His professional relationships involve people who are exploiting him or people he is exploiting, with little space in between. He has achieved a level of fame and cultural recognition that most people spend their entire lives pursuing, and it has made him deeply, visibly unhappy. The backstory the show gives Krusty is the source of most of this unhappiness. He is the son of a rabbi, Rabbi Hyman Krustovsky, and his decision to become a clown rather than follow his father into religious leadership created a rift between them that the show eventually resolved, but that clearly left permanent damage. Krusty wanted to make people laugh. His father wanted him to be something more, or something different. The disconnect between what Krusty wanted to be and what the most important person in his life needed him to be is the wound that everything else in his adult life flows from. The episode in which Bart helps Krusty and his father reconcile is one of the show's genuinely moving hours of television. It is also an episode that the show never fully followed up on, because the reconciliation happens and then Rabbi Krustovsky essentially disappears from the narrative. The healing is depicted. The consequences of the healing are not. Krusty remains unhappy after the reconciliation because the reconciliation was not actually the source of his unhappiness. His estrangement from his father was a symptom of something deeper, a fundamental inability to translate what he feels into a life that reflects those feelings. What Krusty is, underneath the paint and the enormous shoes and the decades of variety programming, is a man who became famous doing something he likes but not something he loves, and who has been dimly aware of that distinction for long enough that it has hollowed him out. He is the show's clearest portrait of what fame without purpose looks like, and the children of Springfield adore him, which is the final cruelty, because the adoration of children who do not know him is the thing that keeps him performing, keeps him in the clown suit, keeps him doing the thing that is not quite the thing he wanted to be doing. He cannot leave because leaving would mean facing what he would be without the costume, and Krusty has spent too long inside the costume to know. Mayor Quimby and the Springfield political machine. Joseph Fitzgerald O'Malley. Fitzpatrick O'Malley, that is his name, the show has confirmed it. The middle names extend to a length that implies a family with a great deal of enthusiasm for naming conventions, is the mayor of Springfield, a position he has held for the entirety of the show's run despite being the least competent, most corrupt, and most openly self-serving elected official in a fictional political landscape that is populated almost entirely by incompetent, corrupt, and self-serving elected officials. Mayor Quimby is a parody of a specific type of American political figure, the Kennedy-adjacent Northeastern machine politician, the kind of elected official who inherited both a family name with regional significance and a set of political instincts calibrated entirely towards self-preservation. He speaks with a Boston accent that becomes more pronounced whenever he is being particularly dishonest, which is most of the time. He is surrounded by aides and relatives who are also on the city payroll. He makes decisions based entirely on what will benefit him personally, and justify this with rhetoric so hollow that even Springfield's generally credulous population occasionally notices. His continued re-election is the show's most direct comment on how democratic systems can be captured by the people they are supposed to be accountable to. Springfield votes for Quimby because Springfield has always voted for Quimby. The alternative candidates who have appeared across the show's run have been either more obviously corrupt, transparently opportunistic, or so fundamentally disconnected from the reality of governing that Quimby wins by default. He is not the best option. He is the familiar option. And in Springfield, familiarity consistently defeats quality. The deeper question the show raises about Quimby without ever answering is what kind of town produces him. Springfield elects Quimby because Springfield is the kind of town that elects a Quimby. The corruption is not an aberration. It is the natural product of a population that has been conditioned, through decades of exposure to a compromised political and environmental reality, to expect very little from the people who are supposed to represent them. Quimby gives them exactly what they expect, and they reward him for it, election after election, in the same way they reward Burns for keeping the lights on and reward Homer for keeping the plant operational. In Springfield, the bar for what constitutes acceptable behavior from people in positions of power has been set so low that clearing it barely registers. Professor Frink and the science Springfield ignores. John Nurtlebaum Frink Jr., known as Professor Frink, is Springfield's resident scientist, a man of apparently genuine intellectual capability whose work is consistently treated by the town around him as a curiosity at best and a nuisance at most. He is associated with Springfield University and the Springfield Science Institute and has demonstrated across dozens of episodes the ability to invent functional technology that is many decades ahead of anything that exists in the real world. Frink has invented teleportation devices, time machines, functional robots, matter transmogrifiers, and a wide variety of other technologies that would, if they worked in the way the show depicts them working, represent scientific achievements that would transform human civilization. And Springfield treats all of them as temporary entertainment. The inventions appear, create chaos, resolve the episode's central problem, and disappear. Nobody patents them. Nobody funds further research. Nobody recognizes that the man down the street has been producing functional scientific breakthroughs for 3 decades, and that perhaps the town should be paying closer attention to him. The treatment of Frink is the show's most direct commentary on how scientific expertise functions in communities that do not particularly value it. He is present. He is capable. He is frequently the only person who understands what is actually happening when Springfield encounters something unusual or dangerous. And he is consistently sidelined in favor of whatever emotional or comedic logic the episode's main storyline requires. His intelligence is acknowledged and then immediately discounted. He is the person who knows what to do and is never listened to. Under the radiation theory, Frink's situation takes on an additional dimension. If the contamination is doing something to Springfield's population that affects cognitive function, and if most residents have had their critical thinking compromised to some degree by decades of exposure, then Frink might represent a case of the contamination producing unexpected, positive cognitive effects in a specific individual, similar to the theories about Maggie. He arrived at Springfield University at some point in his adult life, presumably from somewhere else, and his outsider biology may have interacted with the town's environmental contamination differently than the long-term residents. Or his genetics may have predisposed him to a positive response to the specific chemicals in the water supply. The show does not say. But the pattern of someone with unusual cognitive capabilities existing in Springfield without being able to do anything meaningful with those capabilities because the town is not structured to use them fits the broader picture of what Springfield does to people who have something the system cannot accommodate. The Wiggum family, authority without power. Chief Clancy Wiggum is the head of the Springfield Police Department and possibly the least effective law enforcement officer in the history of television. He is overweight. He is underinformed. He consistently misidentifies suspects, loses evidence, forgets details of crimes he personally witnessed, and reaches conclusions about ongoing investigations that are so far from the actual truth that they function as evidence against themselves. He has arrested the wrong person so many times that it has become a character trait rather than an error. He is not incompetent occasionally. He is incompetent constitutively. And yet he remains in his position, year after year, episode after episode, despite a track record that should have resulted in his dismissal and possibly his criminal prosecution. Clancy Wiggum remains the chief of police of Springfield. This is not accidental. The show has, across its run, suggested that Wiggum's continued tenure has something to do with the political connections that exist between the police department and Mayor Quimby's office, and between Quimby's office and the broader infrastructure of Springfield's civic power. Wiggum is not kept in his job because he does it well. He is kept in his job because he does it in a way that serves the interests of the people who benefit from law enforcement that does not look too hard at certain things. What he is a man who has convinced himself and is working every day to convince those around him that he is competent. The performance of competence, in the absence of actual competence, is something that requires enormous energy to sustain. And you can see that energy in Wiggum's character. He is always certain. He is always declarative. He speaks with the confidence of someone who has rehearsed the part of a capable authority figure so thoroughly that he has forgotten he is performing. His certainty is not arrogance. It is a defense mechanism. A man who knew the full truth of his own inadequacy would not be able to keep doing the job. Wiggum keeps doing the job because he has insulated himself from the full truth of his own inadequacy with a thick layer of performed authority. His son, Ralph Wiggum, is one of the show's most beloved background characters and one of its most quietly disturbing. Ralph is by any measure not functioning at the cognitive level you would expect from a child his age. His statements are non sequiturs. His understanding of basic social situations is fragmentary. He occupies his world with a guileless openness that reads as innocence and that the show treats as endearing, but that could also be read as a child who has been failed by every system that should have been paying attention to him. Ralph's father is the chief of police. Ralph's mother is not present in any meaningful way in the show's narrative. And Ralph goes through his school days in a fog of cheerful disconnection from the reality around him, saying things that make no sense and being regarded by his peers with a mixture of affection and confusion. He is the show's clearest example of a child whose circumstances have conspired to leave him without the support structures that children need. His father is physically present and emotionally absent in the specific way of someone whose entire sense of self is invested in a professional role that he performs rather than inhabits. And Ralph, navigating Springfield Elementary without the internal resources to do it well, has developed a kind of adaptive cheerfulness that looks like contentment but is better understood as survival strategy. Section 3. The darkest episodes. What the show buried and why. The Simpsons is a comedy. This is its formal classification, its cultural position, and its own description of itself. It is a comedy that has been running for 36 seasons and that has made more people laugh more times than almost any other piece of entertainment ever produced. That is real. That is not a thing to be dismissed or argued against. But the show has also, across its run, produced episodes that are not comedies in any meaningful sense. Episodes that use the format of The Simpsons, the characters and the setting and the running time, to tell stories that are genuinely dark, genuinely sad, genuinely disturbing in ways that the comedy format gives you no defenses against. Because you came in expecting to laugh, and the show knows you came in expecting to laugh, and it uses that expectation to get past your defenses before showing you something that would have been too heavy to absorb if you had been warned it was coming. These are the episodes that the show buries. Not in the sense of hiding them. They are all available, they all aired, they are all part of the canon. They are buried in the sense of being surrounded by ordinary episodes, filed between episodes about Homer getting a new job and Bart doing something mischievous at school, so that the people who remember them as dark tend to remember them as isolated exceptions rather than as the visible edge of something that runs through the whole show. They are not exceptions. They are honest moments. Moments when the show stops performing and says what it actually thinks. One fish, two fish, blowfish, bluefish, the episode about dying. Season 2, Episode 11. Homer eats a piece of improperly prepared fugu at a Japanese restaurant and is told by Dr. Hibbert that he has 22 hours to live. The sushi contained potentially lethal toxins. Homer is going to die. The episode that follows this premise is not the episode you expect when you describe its setup. The setup sounds like a premise for a comedy about Homer frantically trying to complete a bucket list in a single day. And the episode does contain moments of that. Homer does compile a list. He does attempt to work through it. But what the episode is actually about is what Homer values when he believes he has no more time left. And the answer is startlingly simple and completely uncomedic. Homer wants to listen to a football game with his father. He wants to be tutored in the ways of being a man by his father, who is old and confused and living in a retirement home and not particularly capable of providing what Homer is asking for, but who tries. He wants to make peace with his sisters-in-law, whom he has spent years in conflict with. He wants to read to Bart. He wants to hear Lisa play the saxophone. He wants to be intimate with Marge one more time. He wants to hold Maggie. These things are not jokes. They are the inventory of a life examined under pressure. Homer, who is often portrayed as thoughtless and self-centered, discovers when he believes he is dying that the things he cares about are not cars or beer or donuts. They are the people in his house. And the episode depicts him, in his final hours, sitting alone in the dark listening to recordings of the Bible because he could not sleep and did not know what else to do. He does not die. The episode's final scene reveals he consumed an incorrectly prepared but not actually lethal portion. He wakes up the next morning alive. He is given a second chance. and the first thing he does with his second chance is turn on the television. This ending is the darkest thing about the episode, because what it says is that the revelation does not stick. Homer experienced a full day of concentrated human experience, compressed what a meaningful life looks like into 22 hours, and then returned immediately to the baseline. He turned on the television. The lesson that proximity to death might have taught him was not absorbed. The reset was immediate and total. And the show plays this as a gentle joke. But it is not a gentle joke. It is a portrait of how difficult it actually is to change, and how easily the gravity of ordinary life pulls people back to the surface after they have briefly touched something deeper. Bart gets an F. The episode about failure, Season 2, Episode 1. Bart is failing 4th grade. He is facing the possibility of being held back a year. He struggles. He tries to get help. He copies a classmate's answers. He prays to God for more time. He gets a snow day. He uses the snow day to study, genuinely study, with more focus and effort than he has ever applied to anything academic. And at the end of the episode, he still fails the test. He gets a 65 out of 100, which is 1 point below passing. And then Bart cries. The scene of Bart Simpson crying at his test paper is one of the show's most quietly devastating moments, partly because Bart is a character the show has established as emotionally armored. He is the rebel. He is the kid who does not care what the school thinks, who does not care about grades, who performs his lack of investment as a kind of identity, and here he is, crying. Not performing sadness for an audience, actually crying, in the empty classroom, over a piece of paper that represents his genuine best effort falling short. What makes the episode more complex than a simple story about a kid failing school is the insight Bart demonstrates at the end. He argues for 1 extra point because his test answer, while incorrect historically, demonstrates an understanding of the emotional reality of the historical figure in question. His answer, while factually wrong, is emotionally perceptive. The teacher sees this and gives him the point. He passes. But the point the episode actually makes is not the one Bart makes to his teacher. The point is that Bart has been capable of this kind of insight all along, and the educational system of Springfield Elementary has never created a context in which that capability had any value. He has been failing tests for years because the tests were measuring something other than what Bart is actually good at. And the one teacher who recognizes what he is good at gives him the point at the last possible moment, in the most contingent and unreliable way imaginable. A slightly less perceptive teacher, or a teacher in a worse mood, and Bart fails anyway despite his genuine understanding. The system almost missed him. It nearly lost him. And the episode does not tell you whether it will miss the next kid who is like him. Homer's Enemy, the most disturbing episode of the Golden Age. Season 8, Episode 23. A new employee named Frank Grimes arrives at the nuclear plant. He has worked hard his entire life. He has pulled himself up from genuinely difficult circumstances through nothing but effort and discipline, and the willingness to do whatever it took to achieve something. He has a degree. He has qualifications. He takes his work seriously. He is, in every quantifiable way, a better nuclear safety inspector than Homer Simpson. And the episode systematically destroys him. Not because he is a bad person. Not because he has hidden flaws. Not because the show reveals some hypocrisy or corruption in him that justifies what happens. Frank Grimes is destroyed because he is a person who believes that effort should be rewarded, and Springfield is a town that does not work that way. Homer has everything Frank has worked for without doing any of the work. Homer has a house and a family and a job and a life, not because he earned any of it, but because the system in Springfield is arranged in a way that allows someone like Homer to exist and thrive while someone like Frank, who actually deserved everything Homer has, falls apart. Frank Grimes becomes obsessed with Homer. He becomes consumed by the injustice of Homer's existence. He cannot let go of the wrongness of it, the fundamental unfairness of a world in which Homer Simpson has what Homer Simpson has, and the obsession kills him, literally. Frank Grimes dies because he cannot reconcile himself to the reality that the world does not reward merit in the way he was taught to believe it would. The episode ends with Frank Grimes's funeral, which Homer sleeps through, mumbling incoherently in his sleep in a way that makes the people around him laugh. The mourners are laughing at Frank Grimes's funeral because of Homer, who is not even conscious enough to attend properly. And Frank Grimes, the man who worked his whole life for fairness, is buried while the man whose existence he could not accept sleeps in the church pew and makes people laugh. This episode is the one that fans who go looking for darkness in The Simpsons always find their way back to. It is the show at its most honest about what Springfield is and what it does to people who do not fit its specific logic. Frank Grimes did not fit. Springfield did not adjust to accommodate him. He adjusted until the adjustment broke him, and the town moved on immediately. Behind the Laughter, the episode where reality collapsed, Season 11, Episode 22. The Simpsons produced an episode structured as a television documentary about the real-life family behind the fictional show about a family called The Simpsons. It is a mockumentary in which Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie are presented as actual people who have been living their lives on television for profit and who are being interviewed retrospectively about what that experience was like. The episode reveals that the family's idyllic public image concealed genuine dysfunction. Homer became addicted to prescription painkillers. The family's finances collapsed under the weight of irresponsible spending. Homer and Marge's marriage came close to ending. The children were traumatized by the pressure of performing a happy family life for television cameras. The Simpsons, the show within the show, was built on the suffering of real people who were pretending, for the camera, to be having more fun than they were. The episode is a parody of the behind-the-music documentary format, and it is very funny. But it is also a moment of the show performing a genuine act of self-awareness about what it is. Because the thing the episode is satirizing is the gap between the performed happiness of a television family and the actual experience of the people performing it. And The Simpsons, the real show, the one you are watching, has spent 36 years depicting a family performing a kind of happiness that the show has also consistently shown to be more complicated and more painful than the performance suggests. The episode is the show winking at you about what it has been doing all along. The Simpsons is a performance of family life. The family performing it is not always okay. The performance continues because the performance has become the thing itself. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie have been performing the Simpson family for so long that the performance is the only version of themselves they have access to. And behind the laughter is the one moment the show pulls back the curtain and lets you see the gap between the family on screen and whatever exists behind it. The death of Maud Flanders. What the show did to Ned. Maud Flanders was Ned's wife. She was Springfield's most genuinely devout Christian woman, kind to the point of self-erasure, supportive of her husband in every context, present and warm and engaged with her family and her community. She was not a major character. She appeared in the background of many episodes and occasionally moved to the foreground when a story needed her specifically, but she was never the focus of the kind of sustained narrative attention that would have made her loss dramatically prepared for. In Season 11, Episode 14, Maud Flanders was killed by a t-shirt cannon. This is accurate. A t-shirt cannon at a NASCAR race misfired and struck her. She fell from the bleachers. She died. This is the canonical cause of death of a recurring character who had been part of the show since its earliest seasons. The manner of her death was, clearly, a comedic choice. A t-shirt cannon is inherently absurd. The circumstances of the death, Homer dodging the shirts so they hit Maud instead, implied that Homer's selfishness was at least partially responsible. The episode used Maud's death to explore Ned's grief, which it did with genuine sensitivity, before pivoting to a subplot about Homer trying to set up a widow's version of grief counseling as a for-profit venture. But the practical reason Maud died, which is widely documented and not particularly secret, is that the actress who voiced her, Maggie Roswell, had left the show following a dispute about travel compensation. She was based in Denver. She had been commuting to Los Angeles for recordings. The show's production company declined to cover her travel costs. She left, and the show chose to kill her character rather than recast. This is a real-world production decision that had meaningful consequences for one of the show's most important secondary characters. Ned Flanders, who is already the show's most quietly devastating character study, lost his wife because of a contract dispute. His grief, which the show portrayed with more sincerity than it typically applies to secondary storylines, was the result of a negotiation that had nothing to do with Ned or Maud or Springfield. And that grief has never been fully resolved within the show's narrative, because the character it was about was not coming back regardless of how the story needed to develop. Ned has been with other women since Maud's death. He eventually married Edna Krabappel, Bart's teacher, in a relationship that fans found genuinely moving because both characters had been through enough loss that their finding each other felt earned. And then Edna also died, following the real-world death of her voice actress Marcia Wallace. In 2013, Ned Flanders has now buried 2 wives. Both deaths were driven by real-world circumstances that had nothing to do with the character's narrative arc. And Ned, within the show, carries that loss as if it were simply what happens to him, as if loss is just the texture of his particular life. 22 short films about Springfield, the episode that showed you everything you were missing. Season 7, Episode 21. The episode that most directly illuminated how much was happening in Springfield beyond the Simpson family's awareness. 22 short films about Springfield is structured as a series of brief vignettes about secondary characters, each telling a self-contained story that takes place during the same afternoon as the main family notices that many separate things seem to be happening simultaneously across town. The episode was influenced by the film Pulp Fiction and its approach to nonlinear storytelling, and it works as both a parody of that film and as a genuine experiment in what the Simpsons format could do when freed from the obligation to center the main family. What it revealed was that every secondary character in Springfield was living a full life that the show had been depicting in fragments without ever connecting the pieces. Apu had an entire emotional world at the Quickie Mart. Wiggum had an entire domestic life that was deeply strange. Professor Frink had a crisis. Cletus, the slack-jawed yokel, had a moment of genuine tenderness with his family. The episode suggested, without stating it directly, that The Simpsons, as it usually functions, is a severely limited perspective on a much larger and more complex world. Homer and his family are the lens through which the audience experiences Springfield. But they are not the whole of Springfield. They are not even the most interesting part of Springfield. They are the part the audience was introduced to first, and familiarity has made them feel like the center of the story. But the center is arbitrary. The center could have been anyone. This is, when you think about it, one of the most quietly subversive things the show has ever done. It made a full episode that demonstrated to its audience that the show they thought they were watching was actually a smaller story nested inside a much larger one, and that the larger story was just as interesting, just as alive, and just as deserving of attention. And then it went back to centering Homer the following week, as it always had. Number. Section 4. The writer's room secrets, feuds, and what gets left on the floor. Television is made by people. This is a statement so obvious it barely registers as worth saying. But it becomes interesting the moment you start asking which specific people made which specific decisions and why. Because the show that appears on screen is not the inevitable result of the story being told. It is the result of a series of choices made by human beings in rooms, under deadline pressure, in the context of relationships and hierarchies and creative disagreements that leave marks on the finished product that trained eyes can see. The Simpsons has been made by many different people across its run. The core creative team that established the show's identity during its golden age has been partially or entirely replaced several times. The showrunner position, which is the closest thing to a single creative voice in charge of an ongoing television series, has rotated multiple times. Creators who were central to the show's success have left under various circumstances, some amicably and some not. Writers who were minor contributors in early seasons became central figures in later ones. The show you are watching in any given episode reflects the specific priorities and preferences of the people who were in charge of making it at that moment. And those priorities and preferences have changed, sometimes dramatically, over 36 years. The Harvard connection and what it built. One of the most distinctive characteristics of The Simpsons writing staff during its golden age was the educational background of many of its key contributors. The show recruited heavily from the Harvard Lampoon, which is Harvard University's humor publication and one of the most historically significant incubators of comedy writing talent in American history. The list of Simpsons writers who came through the Lampoon includes some of the most influential comedy writers of their generation. What the Harvard connection gave the show, at its best, was a particular quality of reference and a particular level of comfort with intellectual material that was unusual for a primetime animated series. The writers could make a joke that required knowing something about constitutional law, and a joke that required knowing something about particle physics, and a joke that required knowing a specific piece of obscure classical music, and they could put all three in the same episode because they had the background to write them and enough faith in the audience to believe the references would land for enough people to justify including them. But the Harvard connection also had a downside that the show's critics have pointed to with increasing frequency as the golden age receded. The writers were, in demographic terms, a fairly homogeneous group. They were overwhelmingly educated, overwhelmingly from specific socioeconomic backgrounds, overwhelmingly similar in certain fundamental ways. And as the show went on, and as the culture around it began to change faster than the room did, that homogeneity started to show in ways that the show was not always equipped to recognize or address. The show's handling of certain characters, particularly characters who were not white or not male or not from the specific cultural context the writing room was most comfortable with, reflects this limitation in ways that have been analyzed in considerable detail by critics who came to the show as outsiders to that context. Apu is the most discussed example, but he is not the only one. The show's history is full of moments where the homogeneity of its creative process produced something that worked perfectly well for the audience it was primarily made for and landed differently for the audience. It was also, in theory, made for. The showrunner rotation and what changed each time. The show's creative leadership has changed multiple times across its run, and each change has left a distinctive mark on the product. The original showrunner, Sam Simon, departed under acrimonious circumstances relatively early in the show's run. His contributions to establishing the show's voice and visual style during its formative years were considerable, and his relationship with Matt Groening deteriorated to the point where the two men were not speaking by the time Simon left. Simon later dedicated much of his time and the fortune he made from his Simpsons royalties to animal rights work before his death in 2015. Al Jean and Mike Rice ran the show during what many fans consider the first phase of the Golden Age, seasons 3 and 4. Their sensibility leaned toward a particular kind of smart, warm comedy that balanced the show's satirical edge with genuine emotional investment in the characters. They left, returned, left again, and Al Jean eventually became the show's long-running steward in its later decades. Mike Scully took over around season 9 and ran the show through what fans commonly call the Scully era, a period that many view as the beginning of the show's creative decline. The shift in the show's tone during this period, toward more surreal and less grounded storylines, more celebrity-driven plots, and a general loosening of the internal consistency that had made the earlier episodes feel like they were happening in a coherent world, is frequently attributed to Scully's creative priorities. The episode Principal and the Pauper, the one involving the revelation that Skinner had been living under a stolen identity, aired during this period and is often cited as the clearest single example of the break with what came before. What is complicated about assigning creative responsibility for the show's trajectory is that television is genuinely collaborative. A showrunner sets priorities and has the final call on major decisions, but the actual writing of episodes involves many people. Good episodes have been made in bad eras. Bad episodes have appeared during good eras. The quality is not perfectly correlated with who was in charge. It is the result of a much more complex interaction between creative leadership, available talent, external pressures, network interference, and the simple randomness of which ideas happen to come together in which rooms on which days. Episodes written and immediately regretted. The Simpsons has produced nearly 800 episodes over 36 seasons, and some of them have been publicly regretted by the people who made them. This is unusual in television. Showrunners and writers generally do not publicly disavow their own work. The institutional incentives of the entertainment industry push strongly toward defending the product, toward treating every episode as a successful achievement, rather than a learning experience that came out worse than intended. The Simpsons has been different. Writers and producers associated with the show have been notably candid in interviews and DVD commentaries about episodes that did not work, about creative decisions that were wrong, about times when the pressures of production led to something being aired that should have been fixed or reconsidered. The DVD commentaries in particular, which were recorded across the Golden Age seasons, are an unusually direct document of a creative team being honest about its own failures in real time. The episode most frequently cited as the one the team regrets most is the one involving the Skinner identity revelation. But there are others. Certain Treehouse of Horror segments have been acknowledged as not coming together the way they were intended. Certain celebrity episodes have been characterized in retrospect as being driven more by the celebrity's availability than by any genuine creative purpose. The writing staff has, on multiple occasions, expressed the view that they pushed certain characters' stories to conclusions they should not have reached, or that they made joke versions of things that should have been played straight. What is interesting about this candor, beyond its rarity in the industry, is what it reveals about the show's relationship with its own history. The Simpsons is a show that knows what it is. Its creative team has been thinking about the show's identity, its successes and failures, its responsibilities to its audience and its characters for 36 years. The candor about mistakes is the product of that sustained self-examination. The show is aware of itself in a way that most television programs are not, and that awareness has occasionally made it harder rather than easier to make the right decisions, because being aware of the stakes of every creative choice can produce paralysis as easily as it produces wisdom. Phil Hartman and the role that died with him. Phil Hartman died in May of 1998, and the characters he voiced on The Simpsons died with him. This is not a statement about the show's policy. It is a statement about what was lost when Hartman was gone. Lionel Hutz, the incompetent attorney, and Troy McClure, the washed-up actor who introduced himself by listing the films you might have remembered him from, were characters defined entirely by Hartman's specific comic performance. The rhythm of his delivery, the particular way he shaped a joke, the confidence he projected in characters who had no business being confident were the characters. Recasting would not have preserved them. It would have created new characters wearing their clothes. The show retired both characters after Hartman's death rather than recasting. This was an act of respect for Hartman and an acknowledgement that the characters he had built were inseparable from the way he built them. It was also, unintentionally, a significant alteration to the texture of Springfield. Lionel Hutz had appeared in dozens of episodes, usually in storylines involving legal matters, and Troy McClure had appeared in even more, serving as the show's primary vehicle for parodies of entertainment culture, advertising, and the specific kind of B-list celebrity who has accepted the distance between his ambitions and his reality. The absence of both characters left gaps that the show never fully filled. The types of stories they had been used to tell were not retired with them, but the specific energy those stories had, the quality of Hartman's performance that made them work, was simply gone. There are episodes in the Hartman era that are difficult to fully appreciate without understanding what was being brought to them. And there are stories after his death that feel slightly hollower than they should, because the tool that would have made them work was not available anymore. The Hartman situation illustrates something about the show's dependence on specific creative talent that is easy to overlook when discussing The Simpsons in abstract terms. The show is not a machine that produces episodes. It is a collaboration of specific people. And when specific people leave, the show changes in ways that are not always acknowledged but that are visible to anyone paying close enough attention. The network's role and what Fox would not allow? The Simpsons airs on Fox, and the network's relationship with the show has been complicated since the beginning. Fox in its early years was a network trying to establish itself as a viable alternative to the major networks, and The Simpsons was its most important asset in that effort. The show was the thing that made Fox relevant. It drew audiences, generated cultural conversation, and demonstrated that Fox could produce content that competed with anything on the established networks. This gave the show's creative team unusual leverage in its early seasons. The network needed the show to succeed more than the show needed the network's approval. And the team used that leverage to push the show in directions that were notably more confrontational and more subversive than what the major networks would have allowed at the time. The satirical treatment of corporate power, the jokes about news media, the unflattering portrayals of politicians, the consistent depiction of organized religion as well-meaning but easily corrupted, the willingness to have characters say things that the network could have demanded they not say. All of this was made possible by the show's leverage in a negotiation that the show was winning. As the show aged and became an institution rather than a phenomenon, the leverage shifted. Fox became more powerful. The show became less essential to the network's survival. And the creative team's ability to push against institutional boundaries became more constrained. The later season episodes that feel safer, more contained, less willing to go somewhere genuinely uncomfortable, reflect this shift in the balance of power as much as they reflect any change in the writer's own creative instincts. There are episodes that Fox requested changes to. There are storylines that were modified or abandoned because of network concerns. There are jokes that did not make it to air because someone at the network decided they went too far. The show you have watched across 36 seasons is not the show the writers always wanted to make. It is the show that survived the negotiation between what the writers wanted and what the network was willing to broadcast. The contract negotiations that changed characters forever? In 2014, Fox approached the show's 6 core cast members, the actors who had been voicing the main characters since the show's beginning, with a proposal to reduce their per-episode pay from approximately $500,000 to something in the range of $250,000. The cast responded collectively, negotiating as a unit rather than individually, and the eventual resolution kept the show going while adjusting compensation structures in ways that have not been fully disclosed publicly. This negotiation was the third major contract dispute in the show's history, following similar conflicts in 2004 and in the early 2000s. Each negotiation has produced a period of uncertainty about whether the show would continue, during which Fox has periodically threatened cancellation, and the cast has periodically threatened to walk, and eventually a resolution has been reached that allowed the production to continue. What is interesting from a creative perspective is what these negotiations have done to the show's relationship with its own characters. The actors who voice Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, Maggie, and the show's other core characters have developed relationships with those characters over 3 decades that go considerably beyond what is usually implied by a voice acting contract. They have inhabited these people for more of their adult lives than they have not, and the threat that financial negotiations could end those relationships has introduced a fragility to the show's creative planning that was not present in its earlier seasons, when the assumption was simply that the show would continue and the characters would be there. Harry Shearer, who voices both Mr. Burns and Principal Skinner among many others, actually left the show following the 2015 negotiations before eventually being convinced to return. His departure was brief, but his statement about it, in which he expressed frustration with the show's creative restrictions, was notable for its candor about the limits that existed on what even the most senior voice actors could influence about the show's direction. Section 5. The Springfield Universe Connections. The show never confirmed. Springfield does not exist in isolation. It exists in a universe, and that universe has been built, piece by piece, across 36 seasons of television in ways that most viewers have never fully assembled. There are connections between characters, between storylines, between the past and the present of the show's world, that the show has left as implications rather than confirmations. Lines of causality that run through the entire series without ever being traced from beginning to end in a single episode or arc. This section is about those connections, the things the show suggested without saying, the patterns that emerge when you watch enough episodes with enough attention, the version of Springfield's history that assembles itself when you put the pieces together in the right order, the Burns Empire, how one man owns an entire town. Charles Montgomery Burns does not merely own the nuclear power plant. This is the first thing to understand about Burns's relationship to Springfield, and it is a thing the show has established clearly across many episodes while somehow never making it feel as alarming as it should. Burns owns the plant. The plant provides electricity to the entire town. This means that Burns controls the energy infrastructure of Springfield in its entirety. Every home in Springfield, every business, every public building, every hospital and school and police station runs on electricity that comes from Burns's facility. If Burns decided to shut off the power, Springfield would go dark. If Burns decided to raise the rates, Springfield would have no alternative. The town's most basic physical infrastructure is the private property of one man, and that man has demonstrated repeatedly and publicly that he is willing to use his control of that infrastructure as a weapon when it serves his interests. He has also, the show has established, made significant investments in Springfield's real estate. He owns property throughout the town. He has financial interests in multiple Springfield businesses. His wealth has been used to influence municipal elections, to fund or defund public services based on his preferences, and to ensure that the legal and regulatory systems that are supposed to function as checks on private power have instead been structured to accommodate his priorities. The show presents all of this as background detail, as the specific texture of Springfield's particular dysfunctionality, rather than as the coherent picture of economic capture that it actually represents. But when you assemble the pieces, what you find is not a quirky fictional setting. You find a town that is, in every meaningful sense, a company town. A place where one private entity's interests are so thoroughly embedded in the physical and economic infrastructure that separating the town's survival from that entity's continued operation is essentially impossible. This is not a novel concept. Company towns were a real historical phenomenon in American industrial history, and the dynamics that developed in those places, the ways that worker dependency on a single employer translated into political and social control that extended far beyond the workplace, are well documented. Burns's Springfield is a satirical exaggeration of those dynamics, but it is not an incoherent one. The logic of how Burns maintains his control is internally consistent and historically grounded. The show just never names the pattern it is depicting, the medical infrastructure, and who controls it. Springfield has multiple medical facilities. Springfield General Hospital is the primary one, and it has appeared in dozens of episodes, usually in the context of someone being treated for something that should have been immediately fatal but turns out not to be. The hospital is staffed by Dr. Hibbert and Dr. Nick, the two most visible physicians in the show's medical landscape, who represent opposite ends of the spectrum. Hibbert is competent and ethical but frustratingly unflappable, and Nick is enthusiastically incompetent in ways that somehow do not result in more deaths than the show depicts. What the show has established about Springfield's medical community, in fragments across many episodes, suggests that it is subject to the same kind of captured institutional behavior that characterizes every other official structure in the town. Doctors in Springfield have known things they did not share. Medical records in Springfield have been altered or selectively disclosed. The healthcare system has provided Burns with services and information that it should not have provided, and has withheld from ordinary residents information that would have been relevant to their health. The most significant medical mystery the show drops and never returns to is the question of what Springfield's doctors know about the town's health outcomes. If the water supply is contaminated with radioactive material, as the radiation theory posits, and as the show has implicitly suggested across dozens of episodes, then Springfield's doctors would be seeing the effects of that contamination in their patients. They would be diagnosing conditions that cluster in specific geographic areas. They would be seeing patterns in the health of Springfield's residents that could not be accounted for by ordinary medical explanations. And yet the show has never depicted a Springfield physician drawing these conclusions or raising these concerns in any serious way. Dr. Hibbert, who is presumably treating many of the town's residents and who would have access to a population-level view of health outcomes that an individual patient would not, has never once said anything that sounds like an epidemiological alarm. He treats the presenting complaint and sends the patient home. He does not appear to be asking why Springfield has the health profile it has. The most charitable explanation is that the show simply does not want to tell that story. The less charitable explanation is that Springfield's medical community, like its legal system and its political system and its law enforcement apparatus, has been structured to serve the interests of the people who fund it and who have the most to lose from honest institutional behavior. The Quick E-Mart network and what it actually is. The Quick E-Mart where Apu works is not just a local convenience store. The show has established, at various points, that Quick E-Mart is a franchise operation with outlets throughout the country and possibly the world. There is a Quick E-Mart corporate structure. There is a Quick E-Mart headquarters, which the show depicted in one episode as being located in India and run by a figure called the Benevolent Despot, a man so elevated above ordinary commerce that reaching him requires an elaborate journey. The episode in which Homer and Apu travel to the Quick E-Mart headquarters to address a complaint about expired products is played as pure absurdist comedy, but it establishes something that the show has not fully explored. The Quick E-Mart is part of a global commercial network, and Apu is an employee in that network, not the independent owner-operator he functions as in most episodes. He is a franchisee. He is operating under constraints set by a distant corporate structure whose priorities may not align with Springfield's needs or Apu's own values. This matters because it adds another layer to the picture of who actually controls Springfield's commercial life. It is not just Burns. It is also every other corporate entity that has a presence in the town, each of which is embedded in larger networks that operate above the level of Springfield's local, political, and regulatory structures. Springfield is controlled from outside itself in ways that its residents are generally not equipped to see because the control is exercised through normal commercial relationships that do not look like control until you trace them far enough upstream. The retirement castle and Springfield's hidden population of the old. The Springfield Retirement Castle is where Abe Simpson lives, and the show has used it primarily as a setting for comedy about aging, memory, and the particular indignities that American culture inflicts on its elderly population. Abe's stories are the ones that go on too long and end up somewhere different from where they started. His friends at the retirement home are defined by their various forms of cognitive decline. The facility itself is underfunded and understaffed and provides the minimum possible care in the minimum possible way. But the retirement home is also one of Springfield's most significant repositories of institutional memory. The people who live there were alive when Springfield was being built. They watched the nuclear plant go up. They were present for events that the show has referenced in flashback but never fully explained. They have seen things that the current population of Springfield has been conditioned to forget or has simply not been alive long enough to know. Abe Simpson in particular has pieces of Springfield's history lodged in his memory that the show has disclosed across many episodes. He knows things about Burns that other characters do not. He was there for events that shaped the town in ways that the present generation of residents are not aware of. His stories, which the show treats as the incoherent ramblings of an old man whose mind is not fully intact, contain genuine information about Springfield's past that the town's official history does not include. The retirement home is where Springfield's past goes to be forgotten. The people who remember the real version of events are sequestered there, their testimony devalued by their age and their social position. And the rest of the town, the people who could benefit from knowing what those residents know, does not ask. Partly because asking would be inconvenient, and partly because getting the information would require sitting with an old person's story for long enough to find the truth inside it, which takes a patience that Springfield has generally not demonstrated. The elementary school as microcosm, Springfield Elementary is the most complete portrait of what Springfield is as a system, compressed into a single institution. It has a principal who was not who he said he was for 20 years. It has teachers who range from genuinely gifted to completely burnt out to actively malevolent. It has a student population that includes children experiencing every possible kind of difficulty that a school is supposed to be equipped to address, and a support infrastructure that is demonstrably inadequate to address any of them. The school's funding situation has been a recurring element of the show since its earliest seasons. The oil well that Burns stole from beneath the school's grounds was the inciting incident for the Who Shot Mr. Burns' storyline, and the school's perpetual financial distress is a constant background condition of every episode set there. The library is inadequate. The cafeteria serves food that is neither nutritionally sound nor appetizing. The equipment is outdated. The building itself has physical problems that suggest decades of deferred maintenance. And yet the school functions. Children go there every day. Teachers show up. Principals administer. The institution perpetuates itself despite being under-resourced, poorly led, and situated in an environment that is actively working against the cognitive development of the students who attend. The school functions not because it has what it needs to function well, but because it has enough to function at all, and in Springfield, that is apparently sufficient justification for continuing. Edna Krabappel, Bart's teacher, is the character through whom the show has most directly examined what it means to be a teacher in Springfield. She began as an antagonist, a teacher who had given up, who was going through the motions, who brought her personal frustrations to work in ways that did not serve her students. Over time, the show gave her more depth, more history, more of the context that explained how someone who was presumably once idealistic about education had become who she was. She had been teaching in Springfield for long enough that the institution had worn her down to something that barely resembled the person she had entered the profession as. Her eventual relationship with Ned Flanders was the show's acknowledgement that she was still, despite everything, someone capable of genuine connection. And her death, which the show handled with characteristic quietness, following the death of Marcia Wallace, left the school with a loss that the institutional structure of the show could not properly mourn. Sideshow Bob's lineage and the Terwilliger conspiracy. Sideshow Bob is, in many respects, the most formally educated and most obviously capable person in Springfield. He is also the person who has dedicated more of his considerable capability to a single unproductive goal than anyone else in the show's history. His obsession with killing Bart Simpson has consumed decades of his life. It has resulted in multiple prison sentences. It has destroyed professional opportunities that his intellect would have made genuinely remarkable had they been pursued differently. Bob is a man who has chosen, repeatedly and with full awareness of what he is choosing, to spend his life in pursuit of the death of a 10-year-old boy. The show has explored Bob's psychology across many episodes. and what it has found is a man defined by a specific kind of wounded pride. Bob was better than everyone around him at almost everything, and his reward for this superiority was to be the straight man on a children's television program hosted by a man he despised. His reduction to Sideshow Bob, to the supporting character rather than the star, was an injustice so fundamental to his sense of himself that he has never recovered from it. And his fixation on Bart, who was responsible for exposing Bob's attempted crime and thereby ending his television career, is the externalization of a rage that is actually directed at the world that put him in the wrong position to begin with. The Terwilliger family, which the show has introduced across multiple episodes, is uniformly like this. Bob's brother Cecil is equally educated, equally capable, equally consumed by resentment of the world's failure to recognize his superiority. Their parents appear briefly in one episode and are portrayed as loving but eccentric. The pattern of thwarted ambition and displaced rage appears to be familial. The Terwilligers are people who believe they deserved more than they received and have organized their lives around the consequences of that belief. Under the radiation theory, the Terwilligers are an interesting case because they appear to have moved to Springfield relatively recently in their family history and to have retained cognitive capabilities that the town's long-term residents have not. Bob's intelligence is not compromised the way Homer's is. His planning capacity, his ability to execute complex schemes, his long-term strategic thinking, all suggest a brain that has not been subjected to the full weight of what Springfield's environment does to people over time. He has been exposed to it, but not for the duration that someone like Homer has. His intelligence in this reading is not despite Springfield, but because he has not been in Springfield long enough for it to do what it has done to everyone else. Section 6. The character theories. What the show never said directly. Every character in The Simpsons has a theory. This is a consequence of having a show that has run long enough for its audience to develop relationships with the characters that go deeper than the show itself intended. When you have watched the same people for 36 years, when you have seen them in enough different situations and under enough different kinds of pressure, you start to develop hypotheses about them. You start to see patterns that the show never explicitly articulated. You start to construct explanations for behavior that the show presented without comment, and those explanations turn out, when examined carefully, to be considerably more coherent than they have any right to be. These are the character theories, the ones the show left as implications, the ones that emerge from paying close attention to things the show depicted but never explained. The Marge theory, the woman who holds the impossible together. Marge Simpson is, by any reasonable analysis, the most functionally competent adult in Springfield. This sounds like a low bar given what we have established about the other adults in Springfield, and it is. But Marge clears it by a comfortable margin. She manages a household with 3 children, a deeply unreliable husband, minimal financial resources, and no substantial institutional support, and she does it with a consistency that the show has occasionally acknowledged as impressive, but has more often taken for granted as simply the background condition that allows the rest of the show's stories to function. The theory that most fans do not articulate about Marge, because it requires confronting something the show would rather not look at directly, is about what all of this competence and stability and patience has cost her. Because the show has, in certain episodes, given you glimpses of what Marge might have been if she had not been Marge Simpson. She has shown artistic talent that was remarked upon and then set aside. She has shown professional capability in every field she has briefly entered. She has shown that she is capable of the kind of independent thinking and creative ambition that the show has consistently associated with Lisa, rather than with Marge. And she has, in every case, retreated from those capabilities back into the role of the woman who keeps the household running. The retreat is not presented as failure. The show treats it as Marge choosing what matters to her. But the theory that has accumulated around Marge across the show's run is that the choice was not entirely free. Marge was pregnant with Bart when she and Homer got married. This is established canon. The circumstances that led to her becoming Homer's wife were shaped by a pregnancy that arrived before either of them had fully figured out what they were doing. The path she was on before Bart was born, the path that might have led somewhere different, was interrupted. The show has depicted this counterfactual once, in the episode about a Marge who did not marry Homer, and what that Marge's life looked like, while not unambiguously better in every respect, contained things that the real Marge does not have. It contained space. It contained the possibility of a different kind of life. The episode treats this as a story about why the choice Marge made was the right one, and it probably is. But it also cannot fully avoid showing you what was given up. Marge's occasional struggles with anxiety and depression, which the show has depicted in several episodes with more seriousness than its typical register, are the show's most honest acknowledgement that the role she has built her life around is not without cost. She is holding something together that requires constant effort to hold. The stability of the Simpson family is not a natural state. It is an achievement, one that Marge has to produce, from scratch, every single day. And the show has been largely content to accept that achievement as the background against which Homer's adventures happen, rather than examining it as the genuinely extraordinary thing it is. Lisa's future. The character the show can't let become who she's going to be. Lisa Simpson is 8 years old. She has been 8 years old for 36 years. And in those 36 years, the show has told you everything it knows about who Lisa is going to be, while simultaneously being unable to let her become it. The flash-forward episodes, in which the show imagines Lisa as an adult, are consistent in their portrait. She is brilliant. She is principled to the point of self-sacrifice. She is lonely in ways that her intelligence exacerbates rather than remedies. She finds connection difficult because the things she cares about are not the things most people around her care about, and she has not yet developed the skill of loving people across that distance. She is going to be extraordinary, and that extraordinariness is going to cost her things that ordinary people never have to pay. The show knows this about Lisa. The writers have known it for decades, and the show has been unable to let it happen because letting it happen means letting Lisa grow up, and letting Lisa grow up means the show changes into something it has chosen not to be. The theory about Lisa that the show never quite voices is about what it is doing to her to be frozen at 8. Not frozen in the sense that she does not have experiences. She has plenty of experiences. But frozen in the sense that those experiences cannot accumulate into growth, into change, into the development of an identity that has incorporated what she has been through. Lisa has the same conversation about her place in her family and her community in season 30 as she had in season 2. She asks the same questions. She faces the same dismissals. She reaches the same conclusions. And then she forgets them, because the show needs her to reach them again next time. If you are paying attention to this, it reads as a specific kind of suffering. Lisa knows things and then unknows them. She solves problems and then faces those problems again as if they were new. She develops understanding and then it dissolves before it can transform her. This is not how growth works in real life, but it is how growth works inside a floating timeline. And what it produces, if you take it seriously rather than accepting it as narrative convention, is a character who is trapped in a loop of perpetual near development, always almost becoming, never arriving. The Bart theory, the rebellion that was never really a rebellion. Bart Simpson is positioned throughout the show's run as the rebel, the kid who does not follow rules, the kid who talks back to authority, the kid who is always in trouble and who finds his identity in the trouble rather than despite it. He is the character who the show defined in its earliest promotional materials as the anti-authority anti-hero of the family, the one who represented a generational shift in how children were allowed to be depicted on television. And yet, the theory that emerges from watching enough Bart episodes carefully is that Bart is not actually a rebel at all. He is the most conventional member of the Simpson family in the most fundamental sense. He cares enormously about being accepted. He cares about his friends. He cares about his father's approval in ways the show has depicted with surprising emotional honesty across many episodes. He wants to fit in. He wants to be liked. He wants the people around him to think well of him. His rebellion is a performance. It is the costume he wears because he figured out early that the costume worked, that it got attention, that it defined him in a way that made him feel visible in a household where visibility was not guaranteed. But underneath the performance is a kid who is scared of being irrelevant, scared of being forgettable, scared of being the kid in the family that everybody loves but nobody particularly notices. This is the inverse of Lisa, whose intellectual identity is genuinely her and whose difficulty with connection is the real thing rather than the performance. Lisa is exactly who she appears to be, with all the loneliness that entails. Bart is performing who he appears to be, and the performance is good enough that the show has occasionally appeared to believe it. The episodes where Bart's performance drops, where the real Bart becomes visible under the pressure of something that the costume cannot handle, are consistently among the show's best. Bart getting an F. Bart facing the end of his friendship with Milhouse. Bart visiting Sideshow Bob in prison and discovering that his most dedicated antagonist finds him interesting in a way that the people who are supposed to care about him do not. These are the moments when the show stops accepting Bart's self-presentation and looks at what is underneath. What is underneath is a kid who needs more than he is getting and does not know how to ask for it without wrapping the request in something that looks like a provocation. Homer's intelligence, the version that got away. The episode in which Homer has the crayon removed from his brain and his IQ rises significantly is one of the show's most discussed installments for a specific reason. It shows you a Homer that could have been a version of Homer who is capable of the things his current cognitive limitations prevent, who is funny in a different way, whose observations have the precision of genuine insight rather than the blunt force of accident, who can see Springfield for what it is. And what the episode establishes, in its darkest implication, is that seeing Springfield for what it is does not make your life better. Smart Homer is miserable. He has more information about his circumstances, and that information is not accompanied by any increase in the ability to change those circumstances. The things that would need to change for Homer's life to improve are not things that a smarter Homer can fix by being smarter. They are structural. They are environmental. They are the product of 30 years of accumulated consequence that no amount of intelligence could easily undo. So, Homer chooses to put the crayon back. He chooses the fog. He chooses the comfortable incomprehension over the painful clarity. And the show presents this as a choice that is, in its own strange way, rational. Because what do you do with clarity in a situation where clarity is not actionable? What does it give you to know what is wrong, if knowing what is wrong brings you no closer to fixing it? The theory about Homer's intelligence is not simply that he is smart underneath the cognitive impairment. It is that the cognitive impairment and the intelligence coexist, and have always coexisted, in a person who is more aware than he lets on of what his situation is. Homer has moments of insight scattered across the show's run that go beyond what his established IQ would predict. He says things that are unexpectedly perceptive. He makes choices that turn out to be exactly right in ways that his incompetence-based decision-making process should not be able to produce. These moments are played as jokes, as accidental wisdom, as Homer being right for the wrong reasons. But they add up, across hundreds of episodes, to a picture of a person who understands more than he is supposed to. The crayon is not just an explanation for his low intelligence. It is an explanation for why someone who understands more than he should acts consistently as if he understands less. There is something in Homer that knows, and the something that knows has found, across a lifetime of living in Springfield, that it is better not to let that knowledge surface. Not because Homer made this decision consciously, but because the environment of his life has selected for the version of him that does not make that knowledge visible. Burns and the monster he decided to be. Charles Montgomery Burns was not always who he is. This is a fact the show has established, in fragments, across many years of episodes. There was a version of Burns that existed before the version you know. A child named Charles who had parents and a childhood and presumably some baseline of ordinary human vulnerability before the circumstances of his life and the decisions he made in response to those circumstances built the edifice of who he became. The show has depicted young Burns in several flashback sequences. He is recognizable as the same person in the ways that matter, but not in the ways you would expect. The cruelty is present in embryonic form. The ambition is unmistakably his. But there is something in the young Burns that has not yet been fully calcified, a capacity for something warmer that the adult Burns has systematically eliminated. The adult Burns is a project. He is the result of a person deciding, at some point, that the things that make humans vulnerable are not worth having, and engineering himself to be without them. The theory about Burns is not that he was always a monster. It is that he chose to become one, and that the choice, which must have seemed strategic or rational at the time it was made, has accumulated over a century into something so thoroughly practiced that Burns himself may no longer remember that it was a choice. He has been this person for longer than most human beings live. The original person, the one who made the choice, has been subsumed by the consequences of making it. There are moments in Burns' story where the show allows something else to surface briefly. His relationship with his teddy bear, Bobo, which the show depicted in one of its most emotionally sincere episodes, is the most famous example. The bear represents something from before the choice. It is an object that has survived from the version of Burns that existed before he became Burns. And when he encounters it again in adulthood, his reaction is not the reaction of a monster. It is the reaction of someone who is briefly reminded of a self they have spent a very long time trying to forget. The Simpsons is fundamentally a show about people who are more than what their circumstances have made them. Homer is more than the radiation and the crayon and the absent mother. Lisa is more than the town that does not understand her. And Burns is more than the monster he decided to become, even if the monster is all that has been visible for longer than most of the people around him have been alive. Marge and Homer, the marriage that should not have survived. By any standard external analysis, the marriage of Homer and Marge Simpson is one that should have ended a long time ago. Homer has, across 36 seasons, done things to Marge that individually would constitute grounds for divorce in any reasonable jurisdiction. He has lied to her, he has endangered her, he has embarrassed her in ways both public and private. He has ignored her needs in favor of his own repeatedly and apparently without learning from it. He has chosen donuts over her. He has fallen asleep during important conversations. He has prioritized beer and friends and increasingly strange adventures over the person he married. Marge has, across the same period, considered leaving. The show has depicted this temptation in several episodes, usually involving a specific man who represents the alternative to Homer, someone who is attentive and thoughtful and who appreciates what Marge brings to a relationship in ways Homer consistently fails to demonstrate. She has always come back. She always chooses Homer. The theory about why requires more than the surface explanation that the show offers, which is essentially that love is irrational and Homer is who Marge loves. That is true as far as it goes. But the deeper reading is about what Homer and Marge mean to each other that the alternatives could not provide. Homer, for all of his spectacular failures as a partner, sees Marge in a way that her alternatives generally do not. He does not love an ideal of her. He does not love the composed, put-together version she presents to the world. He loves the actual Marge, the one who is anxious and controlling, and whose hair represents a kind of personal statement about maintaining order in a disordered life. The one who carries more than anyone should have to carry, and who would not know what to do with herself if she were not carrying it. He loves her specifically. The alternatives tend to love the idea of her. And Marge, for all of her patience with Homer's failures, finds in him something she could not construct from the alternatives. He is genuinely present in the specific way of someone who is not performing engagement, but actually having it, even when what he is having it about is something trivial. Homer is fully in his life in a way that more disciplined, more externally impressive people are not. He has not optimized himself out of the capacity for the kind of uncalculated presence that Marge, who manages and organizes everything around her, needs from the relationship closest to her. Their marriage is terrible by certain metrics and essential by others. And after 36 seasons, it is still the relationship the show is most committed to, the one it has built everything else around, the one it cannot imagine the story without. Whether that reflects the show's genuine belief in what they have, or simply the inertia of decades of storytelling, is something the show has never fully resolved. Section 7. The Meta-Simpsons. When the show broke its own reality, there is a level of The Simpsons that exists above the story being told. A level where the show itself becomes the subject, where the machinery of production becomes visible through the frame, where the creators of the show use the format to say things about the format that cannot be said from inside it. This is the Meta-Simpsons. The version of the show that knows it is a show and uses that knowledge as a creative tool. The Simpsons has operated at this level more extensively and more self-consciously than almost any other long-running television series. Its awareness of its own existence as a cultural artifact, its willingness to use that awareness as material, has produced some of the strangest and most interesting moments in its long history. The show that referenced itself before referencing yourself was normal. The Simpsons was producing self-referential humor before it was a dominant mode in television comedy. In its earliest seasons, before the Golden Age had fully established itself, the show was already making jokes about its own format. Characters would break the fourth wall briefly and then return to the story. The show's structure, the three-act format, the couch gag, the chalkboard, would be referenced within the show as things that the characters were somehow aware of existing. This was unusual enough in 1991 that it registered as genuinely innovative. By the time other animated shows had adopted similar techniques in the late 90s and early 2000s, The Simpsons had already exhausted most of the obvious approaches and moved on to more elaborate ones. The show that pioneered television self-awareness then had to stay ahead of the imitators it had inspired. The most extreme example of this escalation is an episode called Homer's Enemy, which we have already discussed in the context of Frank Grimes. But the meta-dimension of that episode, which is less often remarked upon, is that it is an episode about what it would be like to live inside The Simpsons as a real person rather than a cartoon character. Frank Grimes is, in this reading, a person with the psychology of a real human being inserted into a world where real human psychology does not function correctly. He is destroyed not by Springfield but by the gap between what Springfield is and what it would need to be for his expectations to be reasonable. He is the audience's surrogate, the person watching the show and screaming at the television about how none of this makes any sense. And the show kills him. Treehouse of Horror as a laboratory. The annual Treehouse of Horror Halloween specials began in Season 2 as a way to tell stories outside the show's normal constraints. Because the specials were explicitly labeled as non-canonical anthology episodes, the writers could kill characters, destroy Springfield, and operate according to genre rules that the main episodes would not accommodate. The specials became an institution, aired every year in the weeks leading up to Halloween, and evolved over time from straightforward horror parodies to something more elaborately experimental. What the Treehouse of Horror episodes established, over 30-some years of production, is a parallel version of Springfield where the rules are different, where death is meaningful rather than temporary, where consequences accumulate rather than resetting, where the horror genre's structural logic allows the show to make points about its characters that the comedy format would not support. Some of the most genuinely disturbing material the show has produced has appeared in the Treehouse of Horror format. Not disturbing in the horror genre sense, but disturbing in the sense of the show saying something true about its characters that the normal episodes cannot quite access. The horror frame gives the writers permission to be direct about things they would normally only imply. The most interesting Treehouse of Horror segments are the ones that take the premise of the normal show, the normal relationships, and the normal Springfield, and run them through a horror genre filter that strips away the comedy cushioning and shows you what is underneath. A segment in which Bart discovers he has powers of telekinesis and uses them to become a domestic tyrant is funny as a Twilight Zone parody, but it is also a reasonably honest portrait of what the family dynamics would look like if the comedy were removed and you were left with the actual power structure. A segment in which Homer makes a deal for a donut and is sent to hell is a hell-themed comedy sketch, but it is also a story about a man who consistently makes choices for immediate gratification at the cost of long-term consequences and is eventually facing those consequences in the most theatrical possible way. The Treehouse of Horror is where the show is most honest because it does not have to pretend that it is only a comedy. The Simpsons predicting itself. There is a category of Simpsons self-reference that is more interesting than the general cultural prediction phenomenon and far less discussed. This is the category of moments in which the show predicted things about itself, its own future, its own creative trajectory. Episodes that made jokes about where the show would end up that turned out to be accurate descriptions of where the show ended up. In a very early episode, a character mentions in passing that The Simpsons would still be on the air decades into the future. This was played as an absurdist joke. Nobody making the show in 1990 thought they were building something that would still be in production 36 years later. The joke worked because it was impossible. And then the impossible happened, and the joke became a prophecy. The show has made jokes, at various points in its run, about its own quality declining, about the repetitiveness of its later seasons, about the way celebrity guest appearances had become a substitute for story, about the general phenomenon of a show that had overstayed its welcome but could not figure out how to leave. These jokes were contemporary observations, self-aware commentary on what was happening in the room at the time of writing. But because the show has continued for so long after making them, they now read as predictions. The show told you what it was going to become, and then it became it. This is one of the show's strangest qualities. Its self-awareness is not always comfortable. It knows what it is, including the things about itself that are not flattering, and it says them out loud. And then, because it cannot stop being what it is, it continues to be those things even after naming them. The self-awareness does not prevent the thing being self-aware about. It just means the thing is witnessed. The animation evolution and what it told you. The visual style of The Simpsons has changed considerably across its 36-year run, and those changes tell a story that is distinct from but parallel to the narrative and creative evolution of the show. The earliest episodes have a rough, slightly irregular quality to them. Characters slightly off-model, backgrounds less detailed, the whole visual field a little more improvised looking than what followed. This is partly the limitation of the technology and the production budget of the time, but it is also partly a reflection of the show's identity in that moment. It was a new thing. It had not fully found itself yet. The roughness was authentic. As the show developed, as the production became more sophisticated, and the digital animation tools improved, the visual style became cleaner, more precise, more consistent. The characters became more reliably on model. The backgrounds became more detailed. The color palette became more vivid. The show started to look more like the thing it had become rather than the thing it had been trying to be. And then digital animation removed almost all of the remaining irregularity. And the show started to look, in later seasons, almost too consistent. The rough edges that had given the early episodes a quality of being handmade, of being the product of specific human choices rather than algorithmic consistency, were gone. The show looked perfect in a way that it never had before. And perfect, in animation as in most things, has a tendency to read as slightly sterile. The visual evolution of The Simpsons is a document of what happens when production technology improves faster than the show's capacity to use that improvement creatively. The early imperfection was an asset that nobody recognized as an asset until it was gone. The handmade quality of those early episodes is part of why they feel warm, in a way that later episodes sometimes do not, even when the writing is comparable. Something in the visual irregularity communicated that real people were making this, that specific human hands and specific human choices were producing every frame. When that irregularity was eliminated in the name of quality, something was lost that could not be replaced by simply making the remaining elements better. The Simpsons. Within The Simpsons, in multiple episodes across the show's run, the Simpsons family has watched television programs within the show that are parodies of other television programs. This is not unusual. Most television shows set in normal domestic environments include fictional television as part of the background. But The Simpsons has taken this to a particular extreme by creating complete fictional television universes within its own universe. The most elaborate example is Itchy and Scratchy, the extremely violent cartoon that Bart and Lisa watch within the show. Itchy and Scratchy operates according to the logic of Golden Age cartoon violence, in which a cat and mouse inflict genuinely lethal harm on each other across dozens of short films without any of it having narrative consequences. It is a parody of Tom and Jerry and similar cartoons, exaggerated to the point of absurdity. And the show has used it across many episodes to make arguments about media violence, censorship, creative expression, and the relationship between on-screen content and real-world behavior. What is interesting about Itchy and Scratchy from a meta perspective is that it is The Simpsons making jokes about cartoons while being a cartoon. The show is using a fictional violent cartoon to comment on real violent cartoons, including on the accusations of inappropriate content that were sometimes directed at The Simpsons itself in its early years. It is the show positioning itself as the mature, sophisticated observer of something that it is also, in a different register, a version of. Itchy and Scratchy is what The Simpsons would be if The Simpsons had no pretensions to depth. And by creating it, The Simpsons defines itself against it. We are not this, the show says, by making this. But there is a version of the Itchy and Scratchy argument that runs in the other direction. In a later era, when fans began arguing that The Simpsons had declined into repetitive, consequence-free stories that reset between episodes as conveniently as an Itchy and Scratchy short, the fictional cartoon within the show stopped being something the real show defined itself against and started being something the real show was accused of resembling. The parody had caught up with the original. The DVD commentaries as counter-canon. The DVD releases of The Simpsons' Golden Age seasons included audio commentaries recorded by the show's writers and producers, and those commentaries constitute something that is extremely rare in the history of television. A parallel text to the actual show in which the people who made the show speak candidly about what they were doing, why they were doing it, and how they felt about the results. The commentaries are not promotional material. They are not the kind of behind-the-scenes interviews that are designed to sell the product. They are genuine conversations between creative people about creative choices, recorded without the expectation that they would be treated as official statements about the show's meaning or direction. And because of that, they reveal things about the show's production and the writer's intentions that official channels would never disclose. Some of what is revealed is technical: how a specific joke was written, where a voice performance was modified from what the writer intended, why a particular visual choice was made. These are the ordinary behind-the-scenes details that enrich the understanding of any episode they accompany. But some of what is revealed is conceptual. The commentaries include discussions of what specific episodes were meant to be about, discussions that reveal that certain episodes were attempting things that the finished product only partially achieved. They include acknowledgments of creative failures that the writers recognized at the time and could not fix within the constraints of production. They include moments where the people making the show express genuine uncertainty about whether they got something right, which is an unusual and valuable form of institutional honesty. The commentaries are, in effect, the show's own theory of itself. They are the writers explaining, after the fact, what they were trying to do and how they feel about how well they did it. And they are, for the people who have found their way to them, one of the most interesting documents about the creative process that any television show has ever produced. Number, Section 8. The deepest levels: unsolved, unexplained, and unresolved. We have reached the bottom of the iceberg. This is where the information gets strangest, where the evidence is most fragmentary, where the questions have no official answers and possibly no answers at all, where the patterns that have been emerging throughout this descent become undeniable and the explanations stop being satisfying, and you are left with something that looks less like a mystery to be solved and more like a system to be observed. The deepest levels of the Simpsons iceberg are not about specific episodes or specific characters or specific production decisions. They are about what the show is, collectively, as a 36-year accumulation of choices and stories and relationships and images. They are about what it means for something like this to exist, what it means for a culture to create it and to sustain it and to keep watching it even when the people watching it have grown past the age they were when they started. The Springfield collective consciousness. There is a pattern in the behavior of Springfield's population that goes beyond what any individual character's psychology can account for. Springfield behaves, in aggregate, like a single organism. When something happens that the town needs to collectively process, it processes it in the same way, at the same pace, with the same conclusions, regardless of whether those conclusions are reasonable or accurate. When something happens that the town needs to collectively forget, it forgets it, all of it, all at once, with a thoroughness that is more like biological function than social behavior. This collective behavior is most visible in the way Springfield responds to crises. A crisis arrives, it is dramatic, it affects the whole town, everyone is involved, and then it ends. And the next episode begins with the town in its normal state. Every resident apparently unaware that the previous episode happened. This is a production convention, as we have established. But it is also something more. When you look at it from inside the show's logic rather than outside it, Springfield does not forget randomly. It forgets specifically. It forgets the things that would require it to change if it remembered them. The dome, the nuclear incidents, the repeated catastrophic failures of its institutions. It remembers everything that keeps the current arrangement intact and forgets everything that would require reconsidering that arrangement. This is not the pattern of random collective amnesia. This is the pattern of motivated collective forgetting. The Principal and the Pauper episode, which we examined earlier, showed you the mechanism of this process in explicit detail. The town voted to forget. The vote was formal. The forgetting was legislated. What that episode made visible is that Springfield's collective amnesia is not a passive process. It is an active one. The town chooses, in the specific way that communities can choose things through shared social behavior, to not know what it knows. The question the show never asks is who benefits from this collective amnesia? Who gains from a population that forgets every crisis before it can generate political will to address its causes? Who benefits from a town that processes every challenge to the status quo and then resets to the status quo as if the challenge never came? The answer is obvious, and the show has never said it out loud, which is interesting in its own right. Burns benefits. Every person with a stake in Springfield's current arrangement, every person whose position depends on the town remaining as it is, benefits from the collective amnesia. The amnesia is not a bug. It is the most important feature of the system. The show as religious text, Springfield's Gospel. The Simpsons has been discussed in academic contexts in ways that few other television programs have been. There are college courses about it. There are academic papers analyzing it. There is a book called The Gospel According to The Simpsons that examines the show's treatment of religion and its implicit moral framework. There is a way in which the show has accumulated enough material and enough cultural weight that it functions, for the people who have grown up with it, as a kind of secular scripture, a shared reference point that encodes values and truths and ways of understanding the world. This is partly a function of the show's longevity. Anything that is present in the culture for 36 years becomes a shared language. The Simpsons references have become a way of communicating things that would otherwise require longer explanations. Homer's response to a stressful situation, Bart's approach to authority, Lisa's relationship to optimism. These are not just character descriptions. They are cultural shorthand. They encode specific things about specific human experiences that people use to communicate with each other. But it is also a function of what the show actually contains. The Simpsons has dealt with death, grief, faith, family, work, community, identity, belonging, and the gap between aspiration and reality with more sustained attention than most serious, dramatic television. It has done this while maintaining the form of a comedy, which has allowed it to address things that a drama would have needed to approach more carefully. The comedy has been a delivery mechanism for content that would otherwise be too heavy or too direct. The show's theology, to the extent that it has one, is complicated and somewhat contradictory, which is appropriate given that the show's universe includes a God who appears and speaks and has clear opinions about things, but who does not consistently apply those opinions in ways that correspond to any coherent moral framework. God in The Simpsons talks to Homer several times. He ignores Ned. He appears in Treehouse of Horror episodes in ways that are explicitly comic rather than reverent. The show's God is not the God of any specific tradition, but something more like a cultural composite, a God who functions as a narrative convenience when the story needs him and who otherwise stays out of the way. What the show does believe, if belief can be attributed to a television program, is in the fundamental value of family connection. Not family in the idealized sense. Not family as a set of roles perfectly performed. Family in the sense of people who know each other completely, who have seen each other at their worst and their most embarrassing and their most defeated, and who remain committed to each other not despite that knowledge, but because of it. The Simpsons is a show about people who have no illusions about each other and who stay anyway. That is the closest thing it has to a gospel. The infinite regress. Springfield inside Springfield. There is a moment in the show, referenced in an early Treehouse of Horror segment, in which the Simpsons are depicted as characters in a television show within the universe of another show, which is itself suggested to be a show within some larger fictional context, which generates an infinite regress of fictional frames in which the characters exist at multiple levels of reality simultaneously. This is played as a quick joke. It resolves in about 90 seconds. But the image it creates, of characters who are both themselves and fictional versions of themselves at multiple layers deep, has lingered in the fan community in a way that the joke's brevity does not quite account for, because the image is, in a way, accurate. The Simpsons characters do exist at multiple levels simultaneously. They exist as fictional characters within the show's universe. They exist as constructions of a specific group of human creators with specific intentions and limitations. They exist as cultural symbols that have been processed and transformed by 36 years of audience engagement into something that no longer belongs entirely to their creators. They exist in the memories of people who have grown up with them, where they have become associated with specific times and specific feelings and specific relationships that have nothing to do with anything that happened in Springfield. Homer Simpson in your childhood memory is not the same Homer Simpson in someone else's. He has been shaped by the specific way he entered your life. The episodes you saw first, the context in which you watched, the people you watched with. There are as many Springfields as there are people who have lived inside it long enough to make it their own. The show is a shared object that everybody has a private version of. This is what the infinite regress image was gesturing at in the 90 seconds it had. The idea that the characters are real in ways that exceed their fictional status. That the line between the fictional Springfield and the real culture that has been built around it has become so blurred that the distinction may no longer be meaningful in the way it was when the show first aired. What Springfield tells us about memory and how we keep things? The deepest thing the Simpsons Iceberg leads to, when you follow it all the way down, is a question about memory, about what we keep and why. About why something like this show, this specific collection of stories about this specific yellow family, has lodged itself so deeply in the collective consciousness of a generation that the prospect of it ending feels like losing something that was real. The show is not real. This is not a complicated statement. It is a cartoon. The characters do not exist. The events did not happen. Springfield is not on any map and never will be. These are facts. And yet, the experience of watching The Simpsons is real. The feelings it generated, the connections it reinforced, the Sunday nights it was part of, the conversations it started, the way it shaped how a generation of people understood certain things about family and work and power and community, those are real. The show itself is fiction. What the show produced in the people who watched it is not. This is the thing the Simpsons Iceberg keeps circling around without quite landing on. The show is simultaneously a text to be analyzed and an experience that has been woven into the memories of the people who had it. And analyzing the text, following the theories and the evidence and the patterns down through all the levels we have explored tonight, does not diminish the experience. It adds to it. It reveals that the thing you have been carrying around in your memory, the show you have been returning to across your life, is considerably more complex and more intentional and more genuinely human than you may have understood when you were first watching it. The theories are not the point. The point is what they reveal about the people who made the show and the people who have been watching it. The radiation theory reveals a show that has been quietly documenting the relationship between industrial power and human health for 36 years while pretending to be a comedy. The coma theory reveals a show that has built its most emotionally resonant element, Homer's love for his family, into the structure of its own narrative impossibilities. The mystery of who shot Mr. Burns reveals a show that understands how institutions protect themselves and use that understanding to construct a mystery with no clean resolution. These are not simple things. These are the products of genuinely intelligent people thinking seriously about serious subjects and choosing to embed those thoughts in a format that makes them accessible to the widest possible audience. The Springfield that time built. 36 years is a genuinely unusual amount of time for anything to exist. Most things that last that long change so fundamentally across the duration that the version that exists at the end is difficult to recognize as the same thing that existed at the beginning. The Simpsons on paper has changed in exactly this way. The show that airs today is not recognizable as the same creative endeavor as the show that aired in 1991. The writing staff has turned over multiple times. The production technology has changed completely. The cultural context is completely different. The world that the show is satirizing is a different world from the one it was satirizing when it began. And yet something has survived. Something recognizable has persisted through 36 years of change. The yellow faces. The house on Evergreen Terrace. Homer's relationship with beer and donuts, and his capacity for love that exceeds his capacity for competence. Marge's hair and her patience, and the weight she carries. Bart's posture in the face of authority. Lisa's saxophone. Maggie's silence. These things have survived because the audience has kept them alive. Television shows do not persist through institutional inertia alone. They persist because people keep watching. And the people who keep watching The Simpsons are not doing it only because the current episodes are better than the alternatives. They are doing it because the current episodes are a continuation of something they began caring about at a specific point in their lives, and continuing to watch is a way of maintaining that connection. This is not a criticism. It is an observation about what television can do when it runs long enough. It becomes a form of relationship. Not a relationship with the characters, exactly, though that is part of it, but a relationship with the version of yourself that first encountered the show. Watching The Simpsons is a way of being in contact with who you were at a specific time in your life. And as long as the show continues, that time is not entirely gone. The final descent. What nobody talks about because it is too close. The very bottom of the iceberg. The level that the fan theories and the academic analysis and the content essays rarely reach, because it requires not analyzing the show but simply sitting with it, is this. The Simpsons is a show about the fear of time. About the fear of what time takes from you. About the specific terror of watching the people you love age and change and eventually stop being the people you love in the specific way you loved them, because everyone is always becoming someone slightly different from who they were, and you cannot hold them still. Homer's coma theory is the theory that gets at this most directly. But even outside the coma theory, even just taking the show at face value as a floating timeline cartoon comedy, the emotional truth underneath it is the same. The family is preserved. Nobody ages. The children stay children. The parents stay who they are. The house is always the same. The opening credits always play the same way. You always know what you are going to get. And you watch it because that constancy, that refusal to change, gives you something that your own life cannot give you. Your own life moves forward. Your own children grow up. Your own parents age. The house you grew up in is someone else's house now. The people you loved in specific ways have become different people, and you have become a different person, and the specific configuration of feeling and belonging that existed at that particular time is simply gone. But Springfield is still there. Bart is still 10. Homer is still stumbling through the door at 5:30. The couch is still receiving the family. The opening credits are still playing. The Simpsons is not a show about Springfield. It is a place to go when you need the world to stay still for 22 minutes. It is a maintenance of something that the real world will not maintain. It is a television show doing what no other art form can do quite as completely, giving you the experience of return. You go back to Springfield because Springfield goes back to you. Every episode, no matter how many years have passed, begins from the same position, the same house, the same family, the same town. Everything you expected to find is still there. And that is not nothing. In a world that takes things away and does not give them back, and in a life that moves forward regardless of whether you are ready for it to, having something that stays is not nothing. It is, depending on your specific history with this show, closer to everything. Springfield's lasting question. Every theory in this iceberg arrives at the same unanswerable question. If Springfield is a contamination zone, who is responsible for cleaning it up? If Homer has been in a coma since 1993, when does he wake up? If the shooting of Mr. Burns was never really solved, does justice ever come? If nobody in Springfield ages, what happens when the loop finally breaks? The show cannot answer these questions. Not because the writers have not thought about them, but because answering them would require the show to end. And the show is not going to end. It is going to continue, finding new ways to tell the story of the same family in the same house in the same town. And the questions will remain questions. And the mysteries will remain mysteries. And Springfield will remain Springfield. Impossible and familiar and impossible to leave behind. That is the deepest level of the iceberg. Not a revelation about the show's mythology or a theory about its characters, just the simple, enduring fact that the loop is still running. Homer is still in his chair, Marge is still in the kitchen, Bart is still 10 years old, Lisa is still 8, Maggie is still watching from behind her pacifier, knowing things nobody suspects she knows. The credits are about to roll, and then it will all begin again. The forgotten Springfield addresses. Before we fully ascend from the bottom of this iceberg, there are a handful of specific details and theories that deserve a dedicated portion of their own. These are the things that do not fit neatly into any of the larger categories we have explored. They are the remnants. The fragments too strange or too specific to organize under a broader heading. They exist at the margins even of an analysis this thorough, and that marginality is part of what makes them interesting. The Simpson family's home address is 742 Evergreen Terrace. This is confirmed in multiple episodes. It is one of the few specific geographical coordinates within Springfield that the show has kept consistent across its run. 742 Evergreen Terrace, the house with the green lawn and the 2 cars, and the basketball hoop, and the specific physical geography that the opening credits map with such precision that any frequent viewer could walk through its floor plan without having ever been there. The number 742 has attracted considerable fan attention over the years. It is not a number with any obvious significance in the real world, which makes it feel like it might have significance in the show's world. The theories about it range from numerological to biographical to simply the observation that it is one of the few things about Springfield that has not changed. In a show where everything is in flux, where backstories rewrite themselves and geographies shift and character histories contradict themselves across seasons, the address has stayed constant, 742, the number that for 36 years has been where the Simpsons live. The couch that has seen everything. The Simpsons family couch has been the site of more comedic invention per square foot than any other object in the history of animation. It has been the delivery mechanism for hundreds of distinct visual jokes across hundreds of episodes. It has been replaced, duplicated, transformed, teleported, shrunk, expanded, and subjected to every possible variation on the theme of a family sitting down together at the end of a long day. But the couch is also something else. It is the show's most consistent image. No matter what the couch gag does with it, no matter how the episode deforms or parodies the act of sitting down, the underlying image is always the same. The family comes together in front of the television. They sit, they face the screen, and the show begins. The couch is where the family is a family, not in the complicated, painful, day-to-day sense of being a family where someone always wants something and someone else cannot provide it, and the gap between love and capability creates friction that does not fully resolve. On the couch, facing the television, together, the family is simply a family. They are the image of a family. And that image is what the show returns to every episode, no matter what has happened. Under the coma theory, the couch is where Homer needs his family to be. The image he has been holding in his unconscious mind across however many years have passed in the real world while he sleeps in a hospital bed. The family on the couch, together. Still, in one place. Still his. Under the radiation theory, the couch is where whatever is wrong with all of them is at its most visible and most tolerable. They are shaped wrong by any realistic standard. Their skin is the wrong color. Their hands are missing a finger. Their eyes are too large. And they are sitting together on a couch, watching television, in the completely ordinary way of a completely ordinary family, and none of it matters. Under any theory or no theory at all, the couch is the image. It is what the show keeps returning to. It is the thing that stays even when everything else shifts. And every time the opening credits play and the family rushes through the door and collapses onto it, together, in their specific configuration, in their specific home, you know exactly where you are. You are in Springfield. You have always been in Springfield. And Springfield is, somehow, still exactly where you left it. What The Simpsons has left unfinished? A show that has run for 36 seasons and nearly 800 episodes has inevitably left things unfinished. Storylines that were introduced and then dropped, character arcs that began and were abandoned, mysteries that were posed without any intent to resolve them, promises the show made to its audience, in the sense that a narrative makes promises by raising questions that it has not kept. Some of these are minor. A recurring character who appeared in several episodes during a specific era and then simply stopped appearing. A subplot in a longer episode that was resolved in a way that raised more questions than it answered. A piece of Springfield mythology that was established in one season and then contradicted in another without acknowledgement. But some of them are significant. The question of what Burns actually knows about the contamination and what he intends to do with that knowledge. The full story of Mona Simpson's years underground, the network she was part of, the people who sheltered her. The question of what Springfield's residents would do if the specific kind of clarity that Homer briefly achieved when his IQ rose were available to all of them. The question of what Maggie is eventually going to do with what she has been quietly accumulating. These are not questions the show is likely to answer. They are questions that exist in the spaces the show has left empty, in the margins of the text rather than at its center. And they are the reason that The Simpsons Iceberg continues to generate new material even after 36 years of analysis. Because the show keeps adding to the iceberg. Every new episode, even in the later seasons, deposits new details into the show's mythology. New fragments, new implications, new things to be examined in the context of everything that came before. The iceberg is still growing, even as the show produces fewer and fewer episodes that add to the canon in the specific way the Golden Age episodes added to it, even as the mythology calcifies around the Golden Age seasons as its gravitational center, the accumulation continues. Springfield is still producing its slow, patient, incomplete portrait of whatever it actually is. And the people paying close enough attention will keep finding things in it that were not supposed to be there. The last light in Springfield. It is late. The kind of late where the edges of things start to soften, where the distance between being awake and being asleep begins to close from both directions, where Springfield, which has been the subject of 2 hours of sustained attention, starts to feel less like a fictional location being analyzed and more like a place being visited, a familiar place. One you know better than you ever consciously decided to know it. If you are still listening at this point, you have been in Springfield for a long time. You have descended through every level of this iceberg. You have looked at the radiation, and the coma, and the shooting, and the immortality, and the collective amnesia, and the identity theft, and the genius baby, and the sad clown, and the broken principal, and the woman who fights and loses, and the man who wins and never understands why. You have looked at all of it, and what you have found, at the very bottom, is not a mystery. It is a mirror. Springfield is a mirror. It reflects back to you a version of the world that is distorted and heightened and impossible in specific ways, but that is also, underneath all of that, recognizable. The family is recognizable. The town is recognizable. The pattern of a world that is controlled by forces too large to fight and sustained by people who are too damaged to see clearly and kept alive by the simple, stubborn human refusal to give up on the people we love, that is recognizable. The Simpsons has been showing you yourself for 36 years, in yellow, with 4 fingers, from a town that does not appear on any map. And you have been watching, episode after episode, season after season, because there is something in the showing that makes the scene thing easier to bear. That is what this iceberg leads to. Not a revelation, not an answer. Just the continued, inexhaustible, unresolved, ongoing truth of a family on a couch, in a house, in an impossible town, trying. The loop continues. Springfield is still there. And if you find yourself back here in another late night, another hour when the world has gotten quiet and you need something familiar to hold on to while the darkness does its patient work, Springfield will be waiting. It always is. That is the whole point. We have covered a lot of ground tonight. We started at the surface, where the jokes are, and the catchphrases live, and the couch gag plays. We descended through the forgotten characters and their hidden depths, through the darkest episodes and what they buried, through the secrets of the writer's room and the connections that run through the Springfield universe like underground rivers, through the character theories that the show left as implications, through the meta-Simpsons where the show examines itself, and finally down to the deepest levels where the evidence stops being evidence and becomes something more like atmosphere. The Simpsons Iceberg is not a fixed object. It is a living document. As long as the show continues, as long as the audience keeps watching and thinking and connecting things that were not supposed to be connected, the iceberg grows. New levels emerge. New theories develop. New patterns become visible that were invisible before because the pieces needed to complete them had not all been deposited yet. Version 2.1 of this iceberg is not the final version. There is no final version. There is only the ongoing process of watching closely, paying attention to what the show is doing in the margins, and refusing to accept the surface as the whole of what is there. If you are asleep now, that is perfectly fine. That is, in some respects, the appropriate response to spending 2 hours in Springfield. The place has a gravity. It pulls you down into something soft and familiar and slightly strange, and the next thing you know, you have drifted off somewhere comfortable. And wherever you have drifted, you should know that Springfield is still running. Homer is still at the plant. Marge is still holding everything together. Bart is still 10 years old and planning something. Lisa is still playing her saxophone to an audience of 1. Maggie is still watching. The loop is still running. The treehouse of horror canon and its relationship to the main continuity, one of the most debated topics in Simpsons fandom, is the precise relationship between the treehouse of horror episodes and the main canonical continuity of the show. The official position, as expressed by the writers and producers across commentary tracks and interviews, is that the Halloween specials are explicitly non-canonical. They are anthology episodes told outside the show's normal reality. Characters die in them and come back the next week. Springfield is destroyed and rebuilt without comment. The rules that govern the rest of the show are suspended for the duration of the special, and when it ends, everything resets. This official position is clear, but fans have, over the years, identified a surprising number of cases in which elements introduced in Treehouse of Horror episodes have appeared to bleed into the main continuity in ways that complicate the clean separation the show claims to maintain. Character details established in horror segments have been referenced in later regular episodes. Visual gags that debuted in a Halloween special have reappeared as background elements in later canonical seasons. The strict wall between Treehouse canon and main canon is, on close examination, somewhat porous. The most interesting version of this argument is not the one about specific crossover details. It is the broader argument that the Treehouse of Horror episodes reveal something true about the characters that the main show is not always comfortable acknowledging. The horror genre, as we have already discussed, strips away the comedy cushioning and makes the show's underlying anxieties visible. And the underlying anxieties of The Simpsons, as they appear in the Treehouse episodes, are remarkably consistent with the underlying anxieties of the main show's most earnest and serious episodes. Homer's fear of abandonment, Marge's fear of change, Lisa's fear of irrelevance, Bart's fear of being ordinary, Maggie's Treehouse of Horror appearances are particularly interesting because they consistently depict her as more powerful, more aware, and more capable than her normal show presentation. In the horror context, the show is willing to acknowledge what it cannot quite say in regular episodes, that Maggie is something unusual, something that the category of baby does not fully contain, something that the people around her would be right to regard with a mixture of love and caution. The segment in which Maggie is implied to have sinister powers is one of several that position her as the character most comfortable in the horror genre's logic. The horror genre rewards exactly the characteristics that Maggie has been quietly developing across 36 seasons of silence: patience, observation, the ability to act decisively at exactly the right moment. The horror genre is Maggie's natural environment, and the Treehouse episodes, by removing the constraint that Maggie must be an ordinary baby, show you who she would be if Springfield allowed her to be it. The Springfield Elementary curriculum and what it actually teaches. The educational content of Springfield Elementary has been a source of comedy across many seasons, usually based on the contrast between what Skinner or Mrs. Krabappel says the school is teaching and what the students are actually receiving. The school's curriculum is supposed to prepare Springfield's children for adult life. What it actually prepares them for, based on the outcomes the show depicts, is a lifetime of living in Springfield. This is not a distinction without a difference. The specific shape of what Springfield Elementary produces in its graduates is visible in the adult residents of the town, the people who were children in Springfield and who have now become the population that runs the Quickie Mart and works at the plant and votes for Quimby and drinks at Moe's. Springfield Elementary has been producing Springfieldians for generations. And Springfieldians are, as a type, characterized by specific cognitive and behavioral patterns. They are not curious about certain things. They are comfortable with authority structures that do not serve them. They are easily distracted from systemic problems by immediate sensory concerns. They are not equipped to trace the causes of their circumstances back to the decisions and the structures that produced them. They can feel that something is wrong without being able to articulate what the wrong thing is, let alone what to do about it. These are not neutral cognitive characteristics. They are the characteristics of a population that has been, in some combination of environmental and educational factors, shaped to be manageable. The school does not teach critical thinking about the power structures of Springfield. It does not teach the history of the nuclear plant or the history of the Burns family's relationship to the town. It does not teach the children to ask the questions that, if asked and pursued, would lead them somewhere uncomfortable for the people who benefit from Springfield remaining as it is. It teaches them to sit in rows and answer questions with the answers they have been told are correct, and to associate their capacity for compliance with their sense of adequacy as students and as people. It teaches them that the measure of a good student is the ability to reproduce information on a test rather than the ability to do something interesting with it. And the students who cannot or will not comply with this model, the Barts of the school, are defined by their non-compliance rather than by whatever alternative form of intelligence their non-compliance might reflect. Lisa is the exception who proves the rule. She is brilliant by any measure, and the school has, across many episodes, failed to serve her adequately. Her brilliance exists despite Springfield Elementary, rather than because of it. She reads ahead of her grade level, pursues questions the curriculum does not raise, and arrives at understandings that the school does not have the infrastructure to recognize or reward. She is the student who would thrive in a better school and who is merely surviving in this one. And Bart is the student the school has decided to give up on. The cumulative picture of Bart at Springfield Elementary, assembled across many episodes, is of a child who has been placed in a category labeled discipline problem and who is being processed through that category rather than educated. The school has not seriously attempted to figure out what Bart is capable of, because figuring that out would require treating him as someone with specific and potentially valuable capabilities, rather than as a problem to be contained. It is easier, within the constraints of an underfunded institution, to manage Bart than to educate him. And so the school manages him, and the question of what Bart might have become if someone had been curious about his specific intelligence rather than frustrated by his specific defiance remains permanently unanswered. Moe's Tavern. The unofficial Parliament of Springfield. Moe Sislak's Tavern is the social center of Springfield's male working-class population. It is where Homer goes when he needs to not be at home. It is where Lenny and Carl drink after their shift at the plant. It is where Barney Gumble has spent a dismaying proportion of his adult life. It is where decisions are made, grievances are aired, plans are formed, and the specific kind of community that forms among people who are stuck in the same place and who have found a reliable way to make that tolerable is maintained. Moe himself is one of the show's most deliberately pathetic characters, in the specific sense that his suffering is meant to generate feeling in the audience rather than simply laughter. He is lonely in a way that the show has depicted with more honesty than it typically brings to secondary characters. He wants love. He wants companionship that goes beyond the transactional relationship of a bartender and his regulars, a relationship in which he is the service provider and they are the consumers, and the emotional exchange flows almost entirely in one direction. He loves Homer in the specific way of someone who has made a lesser intimacy into the closest thing to friendship available to him. The tavern has a history that the show has revealed in fragments. It has been, at various points, a speakeasy, a boxing gym, and other establishments before its current incarnation. Moe himself has a backstory involving a childhood in a circus and a relationship with his ethnicity and family history that the show has occasionally referenced without fully exploring. He is not simply a miserable bartender. He is a miserable bartender with a past that the show has never had time to tell fully, and that past is part of what makes the misery specific rather than generic. The tavern functions in the show's ecology as the place where the day is processed. After something happens to Homer, after an episode's main event has occurred, Homer often ends up at Moe's describing it. The tavern is where the town's unofficial narrative gets told, where experiences become stories, and stories become part of the shared understanding of who Springfield is and what Springfield does. It is, in a very loose sense, the town's oral history project, conducted by people who are several drinks in and who do not know they are doing it. The conversations that happen at Moe's are not the ones that appear in the public record of Springfield's history. They are not the ones that show up in the Springfield Shopper or get addressed in town hall meetings or become part of the official narrative that Mayor Quimby curates. They are the ones that happen between people who do not have access to the official narrative and who are making their own sense of things with the limited information available to them. In this sense, Moe's is both more honest and less reliable than official Springfield. More honest because the people there are not performing for any audience other than each other. Less reliable because what they know is incomplete and filtered through the specific limitations of their perspective and the specific distortions that their circumstances have produced in their understanding of the world around them. The thing about Snowball. The Simpsons have had multiple cats, all named Snowball. The original Snowball was the family cat before the show began, already established as part of the household in the first episodes. She died at some point before the series started, run over by a car, and was replaced by Snowball 2. Snowball 2 appeared in many episodes, established as a fixture of the Simpson household, before being killed by a car driven by Dr. Hibbert in an episode that had the specific black comedy quality of the show, making a joke about an established character's death while simultaneously making a point about how casually Springfield processes loss. The episode in which Snowball 2 died also introduced a series of subsequent cats, each briefly named Snowball something or other, each dying in rapid succession in ways the show played for dark comedy. The final cat in this sequence was named Snowball 2, again by Lisa, on the pragmatic grounds that this would save money on a new food bowl, and the episode ended with a teacher accepting this logic and noting that he too was pragmatic in the same way, having changed his identity to avoid detection. It was a joke about the Skinner situation, wrapped inside a joke about cats, in an episode that was nominally about grief. The succession of snowballs, when you look at it from inside the show's mythology rather than as a production convenience, is one of Springfield's most visible demonstrations of the town's relationship with loss. The family has lost multiple cats, Each loss has been real in the moment and then absorbed into the household without lasting consequence. The new cat has always been named the old name. The bowl has always been refilled. The specific animal that died has been replaced, and the replacement has been accepted as continuous with what came before. This is not normal. People who love their pets grieve their specific animals. The individual pet matters. The relationship was with that animal, not with the category of cat that the animal belonged to. Replacing a cat and naming it the same name as the dead cat is not how grief works when grief is working correctly. It is how grief works when the mechanism for processing individual loss has been disrupted. When the town or the family or the person experiencing the loss has, through some combination of environmental damage and learned behavior, stopped being able to hold the specificity of who was lost and defaults, instead to filling the empty space with whatever is available. Springfield treats its dead cats the way it treats most things it loses. It replaces them and gives the replacement the old name and moves on. The bowl is still there. The name is still there. The form of the relationship has been preserved. The content of it, the specific animal, the specific set of behaviors and characteristics and ways of being in the world that made that animal distinct, is gone. And nobody in the house lingers on that distinction for very long, because lingering on it would require confronting something about Springfield that Springfield does not want to confront. The mystery of Springfield's economy. How does Springfield's economy work? This is a question that sounds boring until you start actually trying to answer it, at which point it becomes genuinely strange. The show has established several major employers in Springfield. The nuclear power plant is the largest and most significant, and its relationship to the town's economic life is something we have already examined in considerable detail. But there are others. The Quick E-Mart, the Springfield Tire Fire, which is somehow both an ongoing disaster and an ongoing economic activity, the various businesses that have appeared and disappeared across the show's run, some of which have been established as permanent fixtures, and some of which appear in one episode and are never referenced again. The Springfield economy, when assembled from these fragments, does not make conventional economic sense. There is a nuclear plant and a convenience store and a bar and an elementary school and a retirement home, and there are enough people for all of these establishments to function, but the show has never given any coherent account of what most of these people do for work. Homer works at the plant, Mo owns a bar, Apu runs the Quick E-Mart. These are clear. But what does most of Springfield do all day? The question matters because the economic structure of a community shapes everything about it. What people do determines what they can afford, what their schedules look like, what kinds of relationships they have with each other and with the institutions that serve them. Springfield's economic structure, as the show depicts it, seems to be held together by the same mysterious force that holds everything else together in Springfield: the collective agreement not to look at it too carefully. There are people in Springfield who appear to have jobs that the show has never explained. There are businesses that appear to be operating without any visible customer base. There are transactions happening in the background of episodes that have no apparent economic logic. The town functions as an economy because the show needs it to function as an economy, and it does not need the show to explain how. But the one thread that runs consistently through Springfield's economic life is the thread that connects everything to Burns. The plant provides the electricity runs everything. Burns controls the electricity. Everything, therefore, is downstream of Burns. Every economic activity in Springfield exists within the infrastructure that Burns's plant makes possible. When the show depicted Burns blocking out the sun, the economic logic underneath the absurdist premise was completely coherent. Without electricity, Springfield's economy stops. And without Burns, there is no electricity. This is the economic foundation of Springfield's social contract. Burns is not just the richest person in town. He is the load-bearing wall of the entire structure. And the structure, having been built around him, cannot be separated from him without risking collapse. Grandpa Simpson's unreliable history. Abraham Jebediah Simpson is, in some episodes, the key to understanding Springfield's past. He has been alive long enough to have first-hand knowledge of events that happened before most of the show's other characters were born. He was at the D-Day landings. He knew people who were significant historical figures. He has memories of a Springfield that existed before the nuclear plant, before the current economic arrangements, before the social structure that the show presents as simply how things are. But Grandpa is also profoundly unreliable as a narrator. His stories begin going somewhere and end up somewhere else entirely. Details that seem significant turn out to be irrelevant. He describes events with great confidence and specificity, and those events turn out to have happened differently or not at all, or only in ways that require significant reinterpretation to match his account. He is the town's primary connection to its own history, and he is not a reliable connection. The question of whether Grandpa's unreliability is the product of cognitive decline or something more deliberate has been raised by certain fans and never adequately addressed. Because Grandpa, across his many rambling stories, has occasionally revealed things that seem too specific and too uncomfortable to be random confabulation. He knows things about Burns that nobody else knows. He made a deal with Burns, as we have established, that has shaped Homer's life without Homer's knowledge or consent. He has participated, across his very long life, in events whose consequences have determined the shape of the present without the people living in that present. Understanding the connection. Grandpa's stories, when you listen to them carefully, are not the random wanderings of a compromised mind. They are the careful navigation of someone who knows much more than he is saying, deployed with enough misdirection and apparent incoherence to prevent any single conversation from revealing too much. He talks around the important things. He approaches them and then veers away into something that sounds like confusion but functions as concealment. He is, in this reading, one of the most skilled communicators in Springfield. He just communicates in a way that is designed to obscure rather than to illuminate. Whether this is paranoid pattern matching on the part of fans who have watched too much closely, or whether the show has actually built a version of Grandpa that is more deliberate and more knowing than he appears, is genuinely unclear. The show has not confirmed either interpretation. It has left Grandpa exactly as ambiguous as it needs him to be. The show's relationship with its own endings. The Simpsons has, across its run, produced a number of episodes that function as potential finales. Episodes that end with a resolution so complete, a statement so definitive, that they feel like they could have been the last episode if the show had been ready to end. These episodes were not finales. The show continued after each of them, but they stand in the show's catalog as moments where the series reached something it had been building toward and then, characteristically, stepped back from it. The episode Father Knows Worst, or certain episodes of the Golden Age that ended on notes of genuine resolution, the moments where Homer and Marge renew their commitment, the moments where a fundamental truth about the family is acknowledged and accepted, these are all episodes that would work as series finales in a way that most individual episodes would not. They have the shape and the emotional weight of endings. The show produced them and then continued as if they had not happened. This is partly narrative convention. Television shows cannot have too many episodes that feel definitive, or the audience begins to believe that the story is actually over. The show needs to earn the right to continue by leaving things open, by maintaining the possibility of development, by not prematurely closing any of the loops it has been running. A show that ends every season with a genuine resolution has nowhere to go in the next season. But it is also a reflection of something that the show has been navigating since its early seasons. The tension between the desire to tell a story with an ending and the institutional necessity of continuing indefinitely. The Simpsons was always going to be a show about a family that never fully resolves its tensions, because fully resolving them would mean the show was over. The family has to remain in productive friction with itself and with its world. The problems cannot be fully solved, the growth cannot be completed, the loop cannot close. Every episode that functions as a potential finale is an episode where the show briefly forgot this constraint and produced something that had the shape of an ending, only to realize when the writing was done that the story could not actually end here and pull back from the conclusion it had nearly reached. Burns and the nature of evil in Springfield. Charles Montgomery Burns is the closest thing The Simpsons has to a villain, and the show has been remarkably thoughtful about what kind of villain he is. He is not the cartoon variety of evil, mustache-twirling and arbitrary. He is something more uncomfortable than that. He is the kind of evil that is systemic rather than individual, that is produced by power operating without constraint rather than by any single person's cruelty, that exists in institutions rather than in hearts. Burns is cruel, certainly. He takes pleasure in things that should not give pleasure. He has done specific, individually terrible things to specific, individually identifiable people, and has experienced those things as triumphs rather than as anything requiring reflection or regret. He is not a good person. But the more interesting thing about Burns The thing the show has been building since his first appearance is that he is the logical endpoint of a system, rather than an exception to it. He became what he is because the systems around him, the economic systems that concentrated wealth, the regulatory systems that failed to constrain it, the social systems that rewarded the behavior he exhibited and never imposed meaningful costs for the behavior he should have been deterred from, produced him. He is the accumulation of every unchecked advantage across a very long lifetime, assembled into a single person who now embodies what happens when power is allowed to compound without interference. This is not an excuse for Burns. He made choices. He could have made different choices. The fact that the system produced him does not absolve him of the responsibility for what he has done with what the system gave him. But it does mean that removing Burns from Springfield would not remove the problem Burns represents. Another Burns would emerge, would be produced by the same conditions, would do the same or similar things, because the conditions that produce a Burns are still in place. The system is the problem. Burns is the symptom. This is the show's most sophisticated political observation, and it makes it through the comedy format without ever having to state it directly. Homer working for Burns, year after year, episode after episode, is not just a joke about a dumb man who cannot find a better job. It is a portrait of what it looks like when the system produces both the exploited and the exploiter and places them in a relationship that is bad for one of them and that neither of them has the tools to change. The secondary marriages of Springfield. The show has depicted, across its run, a number of marriages among its secondary characters that have been used as opportunities for comedy, character development, and occasionally something that approaches genuine emotional weight. Some of these marriages have been treated as permanent fixtures of the show's landscape. Some have been explicitly ended within the show's narrative, and some have existed in a state of canonical uncertainty that the show has never fully resolved. Ned Flanders's marriages we have already discussed. The loss of Maude and then Edna, both driven by the real-world deaths of voice actresses, gives Ned's romantic life a genuine tragedy that is all the more affecting for being unplanned. The show did not decide to make Ned a widower twice. It was made a widower twice by circumstances the show could not control. And the resulting picture of Ned as a man whose sincere efforts to build a good life keep being taken from him has an emotional authenticity that scripted tragedy rarely achieves. Apu's marriage to Manjula, which was arranged and then complicated by Apu's infidelity in an episode that handled the subject with more moral seriousness than the show usually brings to interpersonal conflicts, is another secondary marriage that the show invested in and then somewhat abandoned as Apu's role diminished. Manjula and their octuplets exist in Springfield's population, but have appeared less and less as the show has had less occasion to focus on Apu. Skinner's non-marriage to Edna Krabappel, the long-running will-they-won-they between the principal and the teacher, is one of the show's most recognizable secondary relationship dynamics, one that the show eventually resolved in favor of resolution when Ned and Edna got together. But for most of the show's run, Skinner and Edna existed in a holding pattern, connected and yet not connected, aware of each other as possibilities and yet unable to fully commit to those possibilities, which is a reasonably honest portrait of how many actual relationships function when the people involved are too settled in their individual circumstances to take the risk that moving toward each other would require. The episode that changed animation forever and why nobody talks about it. Bart Gets Famous is not the episode that changed animation. Homer Badman is not the episode that changed animation. The episode that changed what was possible in American primetime animation, that demonstrated to every network and every production company that there was an audience for adult animated content and an artistic vocabulary available to serve it, was the two-part Who Shot Mr. Burns storyline that aired in the summer of 1995. The specific change it produced was not about content. Other episodes had pushed the content envelope further. The change was structural. It demonstrated that an animated primetime show could sustain a multi-episode mystery with enough dramatic integrity that it could be promoted as a cultural event rather than simply as a television program. It demonstrated that the audience would engage with animated characters in the way they engaged with characters in live-action drama, tracking narrative details, forming theories, debating outcomes, investing emotionally in the resolution. This seems obvious now because it happened. The landscape that followed, the landscape that includes every adult animated show that has been made since then with any pretension to narrative sophistication, exists in the space that Who Shot Mr. Burns opened. But before it happened, It was not obvious. The conventional wisdom about animation was that audiences watched it passively, that they did not invest in animated characters the way they invested in live-action ones, that the form was inherently disposable in a way that precluded the kind of sustained attention that serious mystery storytelling required. Who shot Mr. Burns proved the conventional wisdom wrong, and then it did the next remarkable thing. It produced a mystery with no satisfying answer. The contest that nobody won, the clues that the victim described as meaningless, the alternate endings that demonstrated the show's own uncertainty about the solution, the resolution that was technically definitive and substantively unsatisfying. This was not a failure of the storytelling. It was the most honest thing the show could have done, with a mystery that was built on genuine ambiguity rather than withheld information. The best mysteries do not have clean solutions. The best mysteries have endings that account for the evidence while leaving the audience aware that other endings were possible, that the official verdict is not necessarily the true one, that the system that produces verdicts is not the same as the system that produces truth. Who shot Mr. Burns understood this. The summer of 1995, America argued about a cartoon, and the cartoon was making a sophisticated argument about how justice works, disguised as a whodunit. What the Simpsons did for fathers. Before The Simpsons, the dominant model for the father character in American television sitcoms was competence with a side of endearing quirk. Fathers in television comedies before 1989 were men who made mistakes in specific, recoverable ways, who provided wisdom when wisdom was required, and who were, in the final accounting, reliably adequate providers of both material support and emotional guidance. Homer Simpson was the deliberate inversion of this model. He was specifically designed, by Matt Groening and the show's early creative team, to be the kind of father that the standard television father was not: incompetent, selfish, impulsive, frequently wrong, occasionally dangerous, and deeply loved despite all of it. He was a portrait of fatherhood that prioritized emotional truth over aspirational representation. He was what a lot of fathers actually were, rather than what television had decided fathers should be shown as. The cultural impact of this choice was significant and continues to be discussed. Homer made it acceptable to depict fathers on television as flawed, without that depiction being a simple moral lesson about flaws to be corrected. Homer's flaws do not get corrected. He makes the same mistakes repeatedly, learns from them temporarily, and then makes them again because the same impulses that produce the mistakes are also the impulses that produce his genuine love for his family, and you cannot surgically remove one set without affecting the other. But The Simpsons also did something more subtle with fatherhood that gets less credit than the obvious subversion. It depicted the genuine emotional complexity of the father-child relationship with a specificity and a tenderness that the idealized television father had never been able to achieve. Because an idealized father cannot make the mistakes that generate the most meaningful emotional exchanges. An idealized father cannot go too far and then have to find his way back. An idealized father cannot be so wrong that his children have to carry him for a while, which is the experience that teaches children who they actually are. Homer has been carried by his children, Bart has protected him, Lisa has guided him, Maggie has saved him. They have been his children and also, at various moments, his guardians, his conscience, his compass. This is not the father-child relationship that television invented before The Simpsons. It is the one that exists in real families, where the power differential between parent and child is not absolute, and where children, even young children, are often more capable than the adults around them acknowledge. The Simpsons got this right in a way that mattered, and it got it right by making Homer wrong enough that the truth had room to appear in the spaces his wrongness created. The Springfield Bugle, Shopper, and the town's information ecosystem. Springfield has a local newspaper, the Springfield Shopper, which appears in enough episodes to be established as a real journalistic institution, but whose coverage of Springfield's actual problems has been consistently inadequate. The Shopper covers events. It reports on what happened. It does not investigate why things happened, who benefited from them happening, or what pattern a series of apparently unrelated events might reveal when examined in aggregate. This is not a coincidence. Local journalism in the kind of community that Springfield represents has historically been compromised by exactly the kind of economic dependency that the Springfield Shopper presumably operates under. A local paper that depends on local advertising revenue cannot comfortably investigate the major local advertisers. A local paper in a company town cannot comfortably investigate the company. The editorial decisions that shape what the paper covers and how it covers it are not made in a vacuum. They are made in the context of the relationships between the paper and the sources of its financial viability. The Shopper has, across its appearances in the show, covered stories about Burns in ways that reflect this structural constraint. When Burns has wanted publicity, the paper has provided it. When Burns has preferred that something not be publicized, the paper has not publicized it. This is not depicted as corruption in any dramatic sense. It is depicted as the normal operation of a local paper in a normal town, which is itself the darkest possible commentary on what normal looks like. Kent Brockman, Springfield's television news anchor, represents a separate and equally compromised branch of the town's information infrastructure. He is not a bad journalist in the sense of being personally dishonest. He is a bad journalist in the sense of being a person who prioritizes his own comfort, his ratings, and the maintenance of his relationship with the power structures he covers over the interests of the audience he is theoretically serving. He panics on air. He changes his allegiances based on who appears to be winning. He announces that he personally welcomes alien overlords in an episode whose comedy depends entirely on the audience, recognizing his behavior as the behavior of a real news anchor stripped of its professional dignity. Brockman is what television journalism looks like when its practitioners have been selected primarily for their telegenic qualities and their willingness to prioritize access over accountability. He is familiar in the specific way of a satirical portrait that is recognizable rather than invented. He is the kind of figure you have seen before, even if you have never quite articulated what kind of figure he is, and the show's rendering of him has helped you see the real-world versions more clearly by showing you the fictional extreme. What Springfield's animals know. The show has, across its run, given its animal characters enough screen time and enough individual personality that they constitute a kind of secondary cast within the show's world. Santa's Little Helper, the Simpson family dog, is the most prominent and the most consistently developed. He is loving, occasionally neurotic, frequently in trouble for behaviors that are entirely consistent with how a greyhound would actually behave in a domestic environment, and the recipient of more focused narrative attention than any other animal in the show's universe. But what the show has done with Santa's Little Helper that is interesting from an iceberg perspective is to occasionally give him what appear to be genuine moments of animal intelligence that go beyond the normal range. He has, in certain episodes, demonstrated what looks like an understanding of human conversation that should exceed his cognitive capabilities. He has responded to situations in ways that suggest comprehension of what is happening around him at a level that the show's usual presentation of him as a lovably dumb dog would not predict. The theory about Santa's Little Helper, which is a minor theory by the standards of the Simpsons Iceberg but consistent with the broader radiation framework, is that the dog has been affected by the same environmental contamination as the human residents of Springfield. The show established that Springfield's wildlife is demonstrably mutated by the plant's runoff. 3 eyes on the fish. Altered behavior in other animals. If the contamination is systematic and affects living organisms indiscriminately, then the Simpson family dog, who has been living in Springfield his entire life and drinking Springfield's water and breathing Springfield's air, has presumably been affected in some way. The specific nature of that effect, in Santa's Little Helper, might be cognitive. The contamination that reduces human IQs might produce different effects in a dog's brain, in the same way that specific chemicals affect different biological systems differently. What reduces cognitive function in a human might, in the specific biology of a greyhound, enhance certain kinds of perception or understanding. The dog might know more than he can express. He might understand more of what happens around him than the family realizes. His behavior, which occasionally seems to respond to things that a dog should not be able to perceive, might be the expression of a form of intelligence that the contamination has produced in him rather than taken from him. This is speculation, but it fits the pattern that the radiation theory has established of the contamination producing a range of effects in the population of Springfield, depending on the specific biology of the individual affected. Homer and Maggie are the extreme poles of that range in the human population. Santa's Little Helper might represent something similar in the show's animal population, a specific case of the contamination producing an unexpected outcome in a specific individual whose biology responded to it in an unexpected way. The recurring nightmare architecture of Springfield. The landscape of Springfield is not geographically consistent. We have established this. But what the show has built in the place where geographic consistency should be is something more interesting than a simple continuity error. What it has built is a space that operates according to the logic of place as it exists in memory, rather than as it exists in fact. Memory of a place is not a map. It does not preserve precise distances and accurate spatial relationships. It preserves the emotional texture of locations, the feelings associated with specific places, the way certain sites feel larger or smaller or closer or further than they actually were. A childhood home remembered is not the same as a childhood home measured. The remembered version has been reshaped by the significance the remembering mind has assigned to it, expanded in the places that mattered and compressed in the places that didn't. Springfield is built this way. The distances between locations shift depending on what the story needs them to be. The nuclear plant, which should have a specific geographic relationship to the Simpson house, is sometimes visible from the backyard and sometimes a significant drive away. Moe's Tavern is sometimes around the corner and sometimes across town. The schools and the shopping areas and the civic buildings of Springfield occupy positions in the landscape that are determined not by any internal geographic logic, but by the emotional logic of the episode in which they appear. Under the coma theory, this makes perfect sense. A dreaming mind does not maintain accurate geography. It maintains emotional geography, the relationships between places as they matter to the dreamer, scaled and positioned according to significance rather than distance. Homer's Springfield is built around the emotional centers of his life: his house, his workplace, the bar where he drinks with his friends, the school where his children are being raised. These are close because they are important. Everything else is positioned relative to them according to how it feels rather than where it actually is. But even outside the coma theory, the spatial inconsistency of Springfield describes something real about how communities exist in the minds of the people who live in them. Your town is not the map of your town. Your town is the specific set of emotional associations you have built up across years of living in it, and those associations reshape the geography in ways that matter more to how you experience the place than any accurate surveyor's drawing would. Springfield is a place built from memory and feeling. It is not a real city with consistent geography. It is the idea of a city, assembled from the pieces of every city that has ever existed in the cultural imagination of the people making it and the people watching it, held together not by physical laws but by the emotional logic of the stories it needs to tell. The final word on Bart's relationship with Springfield. Bart Simpson's relationship with Springfield is the relationship of a person who has been formed by a place he can see clearly enough to rebel against, but not clearly enough to escape. He knows that Springfield is wrong. He has known it since childhood, not as an articulated understanding, but as a felt sense of wrongness that he has expressed through every act of minor defiance. The show has depicted him committing. He acts out because the world he is acting out against is, in some preconscious way, acting out against him. His rebellion has never been effective in any structural sense. He has never changed anything about Springfield. He has annoyed Skinner, frustrated Wiggum, driven Burns to temporary states of frustration, caused property damage in dozens of locations across town. But Springfield is still Springfield at the end of every episode. The things Bart has pushed against have not moved. His rebellion has been absorbed by the system without leaving any permanent mark. This is the condition of every rebel who is not quite conscious enough of what they are rebelling against to direct their rebellion at the thing that actually needs to be confronted. Bart's impulse is right. His aim is off. He knows something is wrong. He does not know what it is or who is responsible for it. And without that knowledge, the energy of his rebellion dissipates into individual acts that feel meaningful in the moment and change nothing in the aggregate. If Bart ever became Lisa, if his felt sense of wrongness became an articulated understanding of its causes and its architecture, he would be formidable in a way that Springfield's power structures have never had to contend with. He has the nerve and the recklessness that Lisa lacks. She has the analytical clarity that he lacks. Together they might be capable of something that neither of them can manage alone. The show has occasionally placed them together against a shared antagonist, and the results have consistently been more effective than either of them manages individually. But the show has also never let them stay together long enough for that combination to become their default mode. They are siblings who live in the same house and who know each other completely and who are capable of extraordinary things when they act in concert, and they almost never act in concert because the daily texture of living together has built up enough friction to make coordination difficult. This is true of most siblings, and it is one of the show's quieter observations about family. That proximity does not guarantee connection, that love does not prevent the specific frustrations of shared space, and that the people best positioned to help each other are often the ones least inclined to do it because they are too close to see the help they could offer from the outside. The Infinite Library of Springfield. Every building in Springfield contains more than the show has ever shown you. The nuclear plant has the unexplored basement with the human skeletons. The library has books that have never been pulled from the shelf in an episode. The city hall has records that Quimby would prefer nobody looked at. The hospital has files on every Springfield resident that, if read in aggregate and by someone asking the right questions, would tell the story of what the contamination has done to the town's health across several generations. The show has built a world that is considerably larger than the stories it has told within it. This is true of all good fiction, to some degree. The best stories imply a world that extends beyond the edges of what the narrative shows you, a world that would go on existing if the camera moved somewhere else. But The Simpsons, by virtue of its longevity and the sheer volume of detail it has deposited across 36 seasons, has built that implied world to an unusual depth. There are things in Springfield that no episode has ever examined. The full history of the town, the people who founded it, and the decisions they made that determined what it would become. The complete medical records of its population. The private correspondence of its most powerful residents. The conversations that happen in the rooms where the show's camera never goes. These things exist in the sense that the world of the show implies their existence without depicting them, and they contain answers to questions the show has never asked. This is the iceberg at its deepest. Not the specific theories or the specific evidence or the specific patterns that the show has made available to the careful viewer, but the implied existence of information that the show has gestured toward without revealing. The things we do not know because the show did not show them. The truths about Springfield that exist in the space where the show's stories have not gone. They are there. Somewhere in Springfield's implied geography, in the buildings the camera has not entered, and the conversations the microphone has not recorded, the full truth of what this town is and what it has done to its residents waits to be found. The show will never find it. It has chosen not to. But the fact that it is there, that it is implied by everything the show has built, is itself a form of honesty about what kind of place Springfield actually is. Springfield is a town with secrets. All towns have secrets. The Simpsons has been showing you a town with secrets for 36 years, and the fact that it has never revealed those secrets is not a limitation of the storytelling. It is the storytelling. Because the secrets of a community are not usually revealed in dramatic moments of public disclosure. They accumulate, they deepen, they press against the surface without quite breaking through. And the people who live inside the community carry them, sometimes without knowing they are carrying them, through lives that have been shaped by what they cannot see. That is Springfield, that is the iceberg. And that is where we leave it. There is a category of Simpsons moment that the fandom calls a one-time fact. These are details, revelations, character attributes, or world-building elements that appeared in a single episode and were never referenced again. They are not contradicted in subsequent episodes. They are simply dropped. The show moved on, and the information it had briefly disclosed went with it, filed into the background of a mythology that has so many details that most of them have never received any particular attention. Some of these one-time facts are minor. A character mentions something in passing that adds texture to who they are without changing anything about how the show subsequently uses them. These are interesting but not especially significant. The show is full of this kind of incidental detail. It is part of what makes the world feel populated and real. But some of them are significant. Some of them, if you sit with them and think about what they imply, change your understanding of the show in ways that make subsequent episodes feel different. These are the one-time facts worth spending time on. The time Homer mentioned his sister. In a very early episode of the show, Homer makes a passing reference to a sister. He mentions her in a context that is casual and unremarkable, in the way you mention a family member you take for granted rather than one you are introducing. He does not emphasize it. The script does not mark it as significant. It is a line that exists and then is immediately forgotten by the show itself. Homer Simpson does not have a canonical sister. This is his character as established across the show's entire run. An only child, the son of Abe and Mona, with no siblings other than the ones the show has briefly introduced in specific episode contexts that were subsequently ignored. The reference to a sister is unexplained. The possible explanations range from the mundane, the writers made a mistake in the early going before the mythology was fully established, to the more elaborate theories that build from the show's recurring theme of family members who were lost or hidden or separated and never recovered. Burns drove away Mona. Abe covered the truth. Homer grew up not knowing the full story of his family. If there was a sister, and if that sister also disappeared into some part of Springfield's hidden history, then Homer's passing reference to her is either a writing error or a thread that was dropped before anyone decided what it connected to. The show has never acknowledged this reference. It has never explained it, contradicted it, or built on it. It exists as a small, unresolved anomaly in the show's early mythology, the kind of thing that only the most attentive viewers have noticed and that the show itself appears to have forgotten. The nuclear plant's other sector? Homer works in Sector 7G of the Springfield Nuclear Power Plant. This is one of the show's most famous specific details. 7G. The sector number has become so associated with Homer's work life that it functions as shorthand for the show's depiction of industrial drudgery more generally. You know Homer is going to work when the episode takes you to 7G. But the plant has other sectors. This is logical, and the show has acknowledged it, in the sense that a multi-unit reactor facility would obviously have multiple operational sectors. The question the show has never answered is what the other sectors do, who works in them, and what condition they are in. If 7G, which is the sector the show has most extensively depicted, is in the state it is in, what does that imply about the sectors the show has not shown? The answer that the radiation theory proposes is uncomfortable. 7G is Homer's sector. Homer is the worst safety inspector the plant has ever employed. The violations in 7G, which are the violations the show has documented, are the violations produced by Homer's specific form of incompetence. Other sectors have other safety inspectors. Those inspectors might be more competent than Homer, which would mean better conditions in their sectors. Or they might be less visible examples of the same systemic failure, equally incompetent, equally dangerous, just not the focus of the show's comedic attention. The possibility that 7G is not the worst sector in the plant, but merely the most visible one, is not something the show has examined. It has been content to use 7G as the specific location of Homer's incompetence without asking what the rest of the facility looks like when Homer is not in it. The rest of the plant is the iceberg beneath the iceberg. The contamination that the show has documented might be the visible portion of a contamination that is considerably more extensive. The parents of Springfield's orphaned children? Several of Springfield's most prominent residents are, within the show's canonical history, people whose parents are not part of the narrative. The biological origins of certain characters are simply unaddressed. The show places them in Springfield without explaining how they arrived there or what circumstances led to their being raised in the specific context they were raised in. Bart's friend Milhouse Van Houten has parents who are present in the show, though their marriage ended in a divorce that was handled in one episode and then treated inconsistently across subsequent seasons. But Milhouse's extended family, his grandparents, his family's history before Springfield, is essentially absent from the narrative. Nelson Muntz, Bart's friend and occasional antagonist, has a mother who is present but largely absent in the practical sense of a parent who is not performing parental functions. His father famously disappeared from his life, in a way the show has referenced multiple times, with the running joke that he is always missing in the most improbable of locations. Nelson is, functionally, raising himself with some assistance from the community of children around him and very little from the adults who are supposed to be responsible for his welfare. Nelson's situation is one of the show's most pointed observations about what happens to children in communities where the support structures are insufficient. He has adapted. He has become capable in ways that a child who is being adequately cared for would not need to become. His toughness is not a character trait, it is a survival mechanism. And the show has occasionally acknowledged this without making it the focus of a story, which is its own kind of honesty about what communities do and do not see in the children they are collectively failing. What the Treehouse of Horror tells you about what Homer fears. If the coma theory is correct, and Homer has been generating every episode of The Simpsons since Season 4 from within an unconscious state, then the Treehouse of Horror specials represent something specific and interesting. They are the dreams within the dream. They are the nightmares that Homer's dreaming mind generates inside its already dreamlike state, the fears that even the protective fiction of the Springfield dream cannot fully contain. What Homer fears, as expressed through the content of the Treehouse of Horror episodes over 30-some years, is surprisingly consistent. He fears losing his family. He fears being replaced, becoming irrelevant, being someone the people around him no longer need. He fears the malevolence of the world outside his home, represented in the horror genre's various monsters and supernatural forces, overwhelming the domestic safety he has constructed for himself and the people he loves. He also, and this is the treehouse detail that is most interesting from the coma theory perspective, fears his own mind. Multiple treehouse segments have depicted Homer encountering some version of his own thought processes as an external force that threatens him. The segment in which Homer's brain goes to war with his body, the segment in which Homer's dreams are invaded by a force that reshapes them. These are not horror genre conventions applied to Homer. They are horror genre conventions that the show has chosen to apply to Homer specifically, and the choice reveals something about what Homer's unconscious is most afraid of when it is operating without the comedy cushioning of the normal show's format. He is afraid that his mind is not what he thinks it is. That the dream he is generating, if you accept the coma theory, is a mind that knows it is generating a dream and is occasionally horrified by that knowledge. The Treehouse of Horror specials are where that horror surfaces, where Homer's dreaming brain briefly recognizes its own condition and recoils from it, expressing the recognition in the only language available to it in the moment, the language of monsters and supernatural dread. The recognition always passes. The next episode returns to normal. Homer forgets, the dream stabilizes, and Springfield goes on as it always has. Maggie's first word and what was lost? The episode in which Maggie first speaks is one of the show's most considered single moments. The producers invited Elizabeth Taylor, one of the most famous and recognizable voices in American cultural history, to speak a single word on behalf of a character who had been silent since the show's beginning. The word was Daddy. The choice of word was the choice of moment. The first thing Maggie says is an address to her father. Whatever she knows, whatever she has been carrying in silence across however many seasons had preceded this episode, the first thing she chose to say was directed at Homer. And then she did not speak again. The show returned to Maggie's silence in the following episode, and every episode since. The first word happened, the second word has not come. And the gap between them, the silence that has extended across more than 30 years of television since that single syllable was voiced, is one of the show's most deliberate, ongoing choices. Elizabeth Taylor's involvement in that moment gave it a weight that the show has never quite recovered from in its handling of Maggie's voice. Having assigned Maggie's first word to one of the most iconic voices in American cinema, the bar for what any subsequent vocalization would need to achieve is impossibly high. Any word Maggie speaks after Daddy, voiced by Elizabeth Taylor, will be a step down, not because the word itself would be lesser, but because the context that surrounded the first word cannot be reproduced. The show may have trapped itself. In trying to give Maggie's first moment of speech the significance it deserved, it may have created a precedent that makes any subsequent speech feel anticlimactic. The silence is, at this point, more powerful than any word could be. Whole. The silence is pregnant with everything Maggie knows and does not say. Everything she has observed and retained and processed behind that pacifier across 36 years of watching her family. The silence is the most significant thing about her. And speaking would end the silence. This is the impossible position the show has put its most interesting character in. The thing that makes her fascinating is the thing she cannot do without diminishing herself. The moment Maggie speaks, she becomes a character rather than a presence. She becomes someone the show can deploy and develop and eventually exhaust, the way it has deployed and developed and eventually exhausted every other character in its cast. The silence preserves her. And the show knows it. What we have learned, after everything, after all of this, after every level of this iceberg has been examined, and every theory has been extended to its logical conclusion, and every pattern has been traced back to its source, what remains? Springfield remains. Yellow and impossible and familiar beyond what familiarity should feel like about a fictional place you have never been. The Simpson family remains. Flawed in the specific ways they have always been flawed, capable of the specific kindnesses they have always been capable of, loving each other in the specific and imperfect way they have always loved each other. The nuclear plant remains. Cracked cooling towers still patched with chewing gum, Homer still at his station, the contamination still doing whatever it has been doing to the water and the air and the biology of everyone who lives here. Burns remains. Ancient and engineered and powered by radiation and sustained by Smithers and protected by money that predates every institution it has purchased. And you remain. The person listening to this, wherever you are, whatever time it is there, at whatever point in your own life this has found you. You have spent time in Springfield tonight. You have gone deeper into it than most people ever go. And what you have found down here, at the bottom of the iceberg, in the coldest and darkest part of the water, is what you always find when you go deep enough into something you love. You find it looking back at you. Springfield has been watching you watch it for 36 years. And what it has seen, in the faces of the people who keep returning to it, in the people who watch late at night when the rest of the world is quiet, in the people who have grown up and had children and grown old without ever fully leaving Evergreen Terrace behind, is the same thing Homer is dreaming about in his hospital bed. Something worth coming back to. Something worth holding on to. Something that makes the night a little less long and the world a little less cold and the distance between yourself and the people you love feel, for 22 minutes at a time, a little more bridgeable. That is what Springfield is. That is what this iceberg leads to. That is what the show, underneath everything it has ever been, has always been about. The iceberg format has become one of the internet's most durable ways of organizing and presenting deep knowledge about a subject. It works, structurally, because it mirrors the actual experience of becoming deeply familiar with something. When you first encounter a subject, you see the surface. You see the most accessible and widely shared information, the stuff that everyone who knows anything about it knows. And you think from that vantage point that you have a reasonable understanding of what the subject is. And then you go a little deeper, and you find something you didn't know before, something that recontextualizes a piece of the surface-level information. And you go deeper still. And the recontextualization becomes more extensive. The things you thought you understood in one way turn out to make more sense in another way, or to be more complicated than you knew, or to connect to other things you thought were separate in ways that change what all of them mean. This is what happens to people who go deep with The Simpsons. The surface of the show is a beloved animated comedy about a yellow family in an impossible town, and that surface is genuinely wonderful. There is nothing wrong with living on the surface. Millions of people have gotten enormous pleasure from the show without going any deeper than the jokes and the characters and the couch gag, and that pleasure is real and it is valid. But the show rewards the descent. It has been built, across 36 years and hundreds of thousands of creative decisions, by people who were putting things in it that they knew most of the audience would never see. Easter eggs and continuity details and character implications and structural patterns that exist in the margins, available to anyone willing to look for them, generating meaning and complexity for the fraction of the audience who goes looking. The iceberg is a format built for subjects like this. Subjects that have a genuine surface and a genuine depth and a genuine payoff for the people who make the journey from one to the other. The Simpsons has always been that kind of subject. It has always had more in it than the surface revealed. And the fact that so many people, across so many years, have been willing to make the descent is the clearest possible evidence of what the show actually is underneath the comedy. It is a world worth exploring. It has been worth exploring for 36 years. And as long as it continues, it will keep accumulating new depths for the people who care enough to look. That has always been the whole point. There is a specific type of Simpsons moment that does not have a name, but that longtime fans recognize immediately when they encounter it. It is the moment when the show stops, when the music goes quiet, when the comedy that has been running beneath everything drops away, and the show just lets an image sit there, in silence or near silence, without trying to do anything with it. These moments are rare. The show is almost always doing something, making a joke, advancing a plot, setting up a callback, establishing a character detail. The machinery of a 22-minute comedy episode does not have a lot of space for moments that are simply allowed to be. But they exist. The final shot of Homer sitting alone by his mother's bedside after she has gone. The moment at the end of the episode where Homer and his family watch the stars through a hole in the roof and Homer is briefly content in a way that the rest of his life does not often allow. The moment where Bart confesses his guilt at Homer's bedside, the moment that supposedly ends the coma, and the camera lingers on the relationship between father and son for a beat longer than the comedy requires. These moments are the show's heartbeat. The places where everything else stops and what remains is simply 2 or 3 people in a room together, carrying whatever they are carrying, being together in the specific and irreplaceable way of people who belong to each other. The best sleeping to TV in the background experience is the one that gives you these moments mixed in with the comedy. The moments where the show breathes out, where Springfield goes quiet for just a second, where you can feel, even in the half-sleep of late-night listening, the warmth of what is actually at the center of all of this. A family, together, still trying. Everything else, the iceberg beneath them, the contamination around them, the theories about them, the patterns that run through them, all of it is just the depth below the surface of that simple and sufficient fact. The family is still there, and somehow, after everything, that is enough. The scripts that were written and never made, The Simpsons has, across its run, produced a number of scripts that were written, read in the table session where the writing staff gathers to hear the draft out loud, and then shelved without proceeding to production. Some of these have been discussed in interviews and commentary tracks. Most have not. The reasons for shelving are various. A script that did not come together, a story that required too much production complexity for the time available, a premise that the writing room decided was not quite right after reading it aloud and hearing it in real time for the first time. What was in those unmade episodes is, for the most part, unknown. The scripts are not public documents. The people who were in the room for the table reads are bound by professional relationships and general discretion from disclosing specific content that was ultimately not produced. The outlines of a few unmade episodes have been discussed publicly by writers and producers, and they are interesting not so much for their specific content as for what they suggest about the creative possibilities the show has considered and then set aside. There were, in the early seasons, episodes planned around major life events for characters that the show ultimately decided not to depict. There were scripts exploring aspects of the Burns mythology that went further into his history than anything the show eventually aired. There were episodes centered on secondary characters that were developed to a significant level of completion before the production decided that the episode was not the right vehicle for the story being told. The unmade episodes are the other iceberg. The content that was generated in the process of making the show, but that the show itself decided not to contain. The ideas that were tried and rejected. The stories that were almost told. They exist somewhere, in draft form, in someone's files or memories, and they represent a version of Springfield's mythology that the audience will never have direct access to. The decisions about what to exclude are as revealing as the decisions about what to include, because they tell you something about the show's understanding of what it is and what it is not. The show that grew up without aging, the relationship between The Simpsons and its audience has changed more dramatically across 36 years than the relationship between almost any other long-running cultural artifact and its audience. The people who were watching the show in 1991 are not the same people they were then. They have aged. They have had the experiences that adulthood provides, work and loss and children, and the specific forms of disillusionment and resilience that time produces in people. They have become different people from the ones who first sat down with the Simpson family and recognized something in them. And the show, which cannot age, has stayed the same. Homer is still in his mid-30s, the children are still children, the house is still the house. The show that the original audience encountered as a comedy about people slightly older than themselves has become, for that same audience, a comedy about people considerably younger than themselves. The emotional relationship has inverted. Viewers who identified with Bart at 10 are now old enough to identify with Homer's parental anxieties. Viewers who identified with Homer's parental anxieties are now old enough to identify with Abe's position of watching the people around them from a remove, knowing more than they can fully communicate and being uncertain about whether anyone is listening. This temporal slippage, the way the audience ages while the show stays still, is one of the stranger things that happens when a television program runs long enough. The same show means different things at different life stages. It does not change, but you do. And the distance between where you are and where the characters are creates a different kind of seeing. The people who first watched Bart's defiance as a mirror of their own rebellious feelings now watch it as a portrait of what their own children might feel. The people who first watched Homer's love for his family as sweet if unremarkable now watch it as a reminder of what love looks like when it is sustained across difficulty and time, and the specific disappointments of adult life. The show has become, for its original audience, something like a photograph of a moment in their lives. It does not move, but looking at it from the present, they can see how far they have traveled from it. New viewers who come to the show without this history encounter something different. They find a comedy. They find specific episodes that are extraordinarily good and others that are less good. They find a cultural artifact whose references have varying degrees of relevance to their specific experience. They do not find what the original audience finds, because what the original audience finds is not in the show. It is in themselves, in the relationship between who they are now and who they were when this show was new, in the memory of sitting somewhere specific, watching something specific, with someone specific who may or may not still be in their life the way they were then. This is what the Simpsons Iceberg ultimately describes. Not a show, a relationship between a show and the people who have made it part of their lives. A relationship that has changed and deepened and become stranger and more layered with every year that has passed. A relationship that will continue as long as the show continues and as long as the people who have invested in it continue to watch. The iceberg is not just the show. It is the show and the audience and the 36 years of time that have passed between them. It is everything that has accumulated in that space. It is the complete history of a cultural relationship that is still ongoing, and the bottom of it is still nowhere to be found. And if you have made it here, to the very last word of the very last section, having stayed awake or half awake or entirely asleep through everything that came before, then you have done something that most people will never do. You have gone all the way through the Springfield iceberg. You have seen what is under the surface, under the layers beneath that surface, and under the layers beneath those layers. You have spent real time in a place that does not exist, with people who are not real, thinking about questions that have no official answers. And whatever you found down here, whatever resonated or surprised or quietly landed somewhere deep enough to stay, was worth the descent. That is what icebergs are for. Not to be conquered, but to be explored. Not to be fully mapped, but to be moved through, slowly, with attention, until the darkness of the deep water starts to feel less like absence and more like space. Space for the things that the surface cannot hold. Springfield will still be there in the morning. Homer is still at the plant. Marge is still holding everything together. Bart is still 10 years old. Lisa is still 8. Maggie is still watching from behind her pacifier, knowing things nobody suspects she knows. The loop is still running. Good night.